And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. It's already a fantastic crowd. As usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And quite a week. It's certainly super warm today, which
Beautiful.
is we're kicking right into the June weather. And the world has been an insane place of late, as we've seen.
The world is an insane asylum.
It is. Well, you come out of one op and into another. This is the way that they're trying to work it. And it's very interesting to come on to this 52nd anniversary of the RFK assassination, because there were so many ops active in that summer of 1968 that, in a way, what we're playing out here in 2020 is that remarkable mirroring back right down to the SpaceX launch from last week, which was alluding to all of the moon launches that were coming up there for everyone in the 60s. Of course, that was 68. They were doing a lot of shooting things out, but they didn't make it to the moon until 69. They're talking of going to the moon. You have all these riots, and you have the city pandemonium. You have a presidential election, a divided electorate, an awful lot of things in common with 1968. And there's a great lesson in that, but there's also a deep state playbook that knows how to rehash and redo their operations from the past into the future. I know that Professor Scott has called 1963 the year one of the deep state revolt against the White House. And so I guess we'd be in year 57 now for that, which is kind of interesting when we look at these patterns, because what I found in looking at the RFK assassination, and we've done shows on him here before, and the deeper elements involved in the deep state elimination of Senator Kennedy, it's quite remarkable. Usually when you go forward in time, more things come out, and you find that this document was released, or we know this now. What's strange in this case is the further back you go, the less tainted the information is. Right around the beginning, there was a heck of a lot of information that really gave us all the handwriting on the wall for this case. And they've been able to obscure it over time and make it into this, this entire show that is about the lone assassin and this kind of thing. So it's very interesting how they played Sirhan in this whole story, and it comes out remarkable. Now, in my conversation last week with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., of course, although the episode was about medical tyranny, we got around to the assassination of his father, and he revealed that his own research had taken him to Thane Eugene Cesar. And we're going to see why that is. And I'm going to reveal some things tonight that are really going to put these pieces together after 52 years. And the remarkable courage it takes for someone in his position to come forward. Because this has been the big thing. The family has not come forward in the past. Although if you look deeply, Jacqueline Kennedy, for example, made a series of tapes with Arthur Schlesinger, which were to be released in the future, and those tapes were terribly edited and came out in some haphazard fashion a year or two ago. But she also, while running a publishing company, was able to push a book that was by a number of French intelligence authors, and it was called Farewell America. And it was all about how French intelligence had come to this conclusion in relation to LBJ. And LBJ being behind the JFK assassination, which is very important when we arrive at the doorstep of the RFK assassination in 1968, because we need to find ourselves in that mode of understanding the nature of the times and the political underpinnings. Now, LBJ had got in there, obviously, with President Kennedy's assassination, and he had run he had beaten Barry Goldwater in 1964 by a tremendous margin. I mean, it was like a complete wipeout, 60-40. One of the greatest in history. The only one that I think that was bigger was the Nixon wipeout of McGovern in 72. So it's very interesting when you look at these things. What we have is Johnson getting in there and thinking, well, I've done all these favors, for the deep staters, and what I can do is play this my own way. But he gets wrapped up in his own Vietnam world and pushing for those things behind the scenes. And this is exactly what President Kennedy had been warning about. And President Kennedy's plan on record was to pull all the troops out by 1965. So there wouldn't have been any Vietnam War and all the, burning the draft cards and all the violence and all the bombings of Hanoi and all that stuff. None of it would have happened. It would not have been realized. So you can see this is part of the activity of the deep state in removing Kennedy. And so when we get to 1968, Johnson is running, and he gets this challenger named Eugene McCarthy, who's a senator, who comes up and has an unusually strong showing, almost beats him in New Hampshire very early on in the whole race. And what happens is it piques RFK's interest that Johnson is so weak, and he decides, this is my chance to really stand up and get him out of there, get us out of Vietnam, get the records on my brother's assassination, the whole thing. It's right there standing in front of him, and he decides to go for it after really holding off. I mean, he does not announce until March of 1968. So that's late.
That's really late.
Yeah, think about it. That's like when Bloomberg got in, pretty much. And Bloomberg, the billionaire boob who got in and tried to buy the election, gets out like 3 weeks later when they tell him, hey, we're going to run the COVID operation. So, tamp everything down. I do want to mention, by the way, before we get into the episode, the incredible collapse of the COVID operation. It has been stunning. They went from, the world is on the doorstep of plague to, well, this might be as bad as the flu. All their studies have collapsed, and some other studies collapsed. Of course, the Imperial College study out of London that got this hysteria going collapsed.
The Lancet, about the hydroxychloroquine.
About the hydroxychloroquine. And the Lancet study is important because they were trying to knock this hydroxychloroquine as a potential, something that they could use for COVID where they wouldn't need vaccines. They just have people getting in there and taking this medicine. And they were really pushing against that because this thing is cheap and very effective. And it's been used for 70 years. Now, what's so fascinating about this is there was another report that was leaked. And this report now was from the German government, and it was health ministers talking back and forth. And they were saying, look at the data. There's no difference between lockdown and non-lockdown. This was all a mistake. That's their own language. Fauci comes out and says, well, masks are symbolic, and there probably won't be a resurgence in the fall. The whole thing is just... And so layer upon layer, op upon op, now they've loaded us into this other op. And what I want to do is really point out that as we've been focusing on here over the past few months, and a number of other researchers like Catherine Austin Fitts and Joseph Farrell and people of that nature, so many actually, have been looking this dead in the eye and saying the COVID thing's an op. Not that the virus doesn't exist or there isn't some kind of virulent form of flu out there, but as it goes, it's an op. And it's there to introduce this whole lockdown surveillance control system and the Gates vaccine. So the people who have been bringing you that information are being proved correct daily. So now that's very important because as we talk about and get into these other ops that are now, when we had this tragic incident and then something else comes in and piggybacks on top of it, this is the nature of how we can parse out what's going on with the deep state and their operations. And it looks like they're going to throw the kitchen sink at 2020 to get what they want. So it's very important for us to stay centered, stay objective, stay focused, not get caught up in over-identification with these things. Because
equanimity. That's what I tweeted out.
That's a good word.
It's
actually
a beautiful word. It's one of my favorite words.
I think what's everyone is being invited to do is identify. And what it reminds me very strongly of is when you look at the Palestinian-Israeli struggle, which has so many deep players on either side. And, it is to get us into this mode of division and combat, because when you're in that mode, things like the Constitution can go out the window, and that's exactly what these forces want. And when you see forces like that infiltrating organic movements or things that are happening on the ground, you see like random groups walking around and sending out flares and possessing incredible just riot technology and coordination. It is, I mean, that is a deep state black op. So it's not to be underestimated. We're going to get more into that as things get revealed. And, it was interesting, actually. Professor Scott had put out something saying that he was looking for information about this and in relation to the Minneapolis Police Department and the police there. And it was fascinating the amount of roadblocks he was coming into, which I found very interesting from a researcher of his caliber.
What was he trying to find out about the Minneapolis Police Department?
He wanted to know about the backgrounds of the police officers involved.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that that wasn't easily accessible to him, I think is very, very telling. And we're going to get into that as time goes here. More of these details are going to come forward. But I want to say, in terms of the op that we've been riding out and that they're cashing in on, the COVID op, just as we've been telling you this over the past 3 months, it's something where, if we can keep that clear focus without the emotional over-identification. You remember when the COVID thing, it was all, oh, everyone's going to die, and, we must stand tall against death, and, how dare you not wear a mask and die, and all these things. Well, it turns out all their facts and figures were wrong on that. And that, yes, there are natural deaths that occur through like a flu cycle and things of this nature, but that they were trying to hype us into a state of mind, and that they failed in the final analysis, and that the lockdowns that they wrought on society really brought in incredible unemployment pain, financial pain. And don't tell me that some of that didn't play out in some of the actions that we heard about in the protests and the riots and things. That is directly related, in my opinion. And those terrible, the governors, like Gretchen Whitmer. I hate to point her out, but she's made herself a poster child. And of course, our friend Gavin Newsom out there in California. These people were talking about martial law and really just letting the whole thing go to their heads. Now they have a different type of martial law in mind. So it is quite fascinating, though. We have to remember that hyper-emotionalism to take you out of your center and make you susceptible to anything. That's macrocosm. But you can do that microcosm with an individual too. So when you take an individual out of his or her center, you can brainwash them and you can make them do all sorts of things. And we've looked at some incredible examples of this, like Squeaky Fromm, who was part of the Manson gang, how they manipulated her to be a presidential assassin and that she got that close. This works on an individual level, and the way it works is programming, just like the mainstream media programs us. And I have to say that one thing we've learned in 2020 even more is that the media has completely gone off. They've just completely failed us in terms of getting information out there, and they've just been taken over by psychotic forces, whose drive and greed are now kind of like nakedly out there, and their ambition to destroy is more nakedly out there than ever. So they're busy programming and manipulating the conversation and these narratives. But we have the advantage of these researchers who've gone into these things before and led us into these corridors of the mind and manipulation. And when we get past that mind control element, when we get past that entrainment element, we start seeing face-to-face what you're looking at. So suddenly everyone switches out of acknowledging Bill Gates and all the stuff that he was responsible for. And, people were getting very smart on that too. They were saying, oh, he's also responsible for the satellite companies. That's a big deal. This is a very destructive.
Well, in for-profit prisons, we found that out also.
Yes, in the UK. So we have to look at the multiple op aspect of this. So when we draw it back in history and we stand at this reflecting point from 52 years ago, June 5th, tonight, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. And you think about what one Kennedy president did to that deep state and how they had to take all kinds of risks to get rid of him. Well, now we had another one coming into office, but he was just a senator. He wasn't yet a president. So it was in a sense, it was more difficult to get rid of the president. It was going to be easier to get rid of the senator.
Well, criminals get emboldened if they get away with a crime.
No
right?
question. And just 2 months earlier, they had removed Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. So the stage was set, and there was looting and there were riots in that period because of the assassination of King. And Kennedy was a unifying factor. He was leading in all the polls, and he had won the California primary against McCarthy. And he was trouncing McCarthy, who didn't have much of a personality, and he had just a few good issues. He was anti-war. And on the other side, they had not decided on Nixon yet. Nixon was coming. He was moving up in the process. And they were looking at other people, even George Romney, Mitt Romney's dad, and Ronald Reagan, who had come in just 2 years earlier as a kind of a flamethrower governor from California. Very different from the president who shows up in 1981. Much more confrontational. And he was the father of that modern conservative movement in the 80s, but really in the 60s, he was even more hardcore. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 90, and we are on the 52nd anniversary of the RFK assassination. We're going to bring forward some major revelations tonight and put it on the record. We did speak with RF Kennedy Jr. last week, and he opened up to the fact that he had been looking, and that it was actually Paul Schrade, who was a friend of his father and was deep in labor relations for the Kennedy campaign in 1968, who was present there in the kitchen with the shooting, that had originally been the person who had convinced him something else was active. Now, when you get into the case, the first thing you realize is that the science of it is instantly on the aspect that Sirhan couldn't have killed Robert Kennedy because of the fact that the person who was the coroner showed where the bullet came from, and the bullet came directly about an inch behind Robert F. Kennedy's right ear. And that's how he was killed. And all the witnesses put Sirhan about 3 to 5 feet in front of Kennedy. So who could have shot him? Now, the police overlooked these aspects, and Noguchi landed in all kinds of trouble for it. Noguchi, I want to show a couple of things about Noguchi here. Now, here's his actual report. I'm going to read from it. He says, the proximity of the murder weapon to the 3 gunshot wounds of Senator Kennedy as to muzzle distance, in my opinion, in the head wound, right mastoid, it was 3 inches from the right ear. The gunshot wound, nearly a contact wound. Gunshot wound number 3 was about the same, very close. So these are not shots fired from somebody 3 or 5 feet in front of you. They're right there, somebody right behind you. That's from his official report after examining the body. When asked to describe it, Noguchi said, well, it was about here. Take a look. That's
pretty damn
very close. So somebody had to be right there with a gun to shoot him. Now, Sirhan, interestingly enough, when he gets into the pantry, and anyone who observes him just says he's this kind of glossy-eyed zombie, and at a certain point, he just starts firing away, creating a huge distraction for whoever it is that's going to get into position. Now, Noguchi's scenario was this, that the shots are coming at the back of Kennedy's head and through his back, and that the person who is firing from the front, that's Sirhan there. Wherever he's firing, it goes off, it hits other people, it hits the wall, but the shots that hit Kennedy are from directly behind him. That's his scenario. Now, Noguchi had an incredible past in a history as the coroner of Los Angeles County, and he had an impeccable record, and until this case, he really didn't land himself in any political hot water. Well, with this one, everyone and their grandmother wanted to take him off the case. And what's interesting is strange people came forward to get him off the case, including Frank Sinatra. Let's put that
What do you
together.
make of that?
Well, we have to understand that Sinatra was deeply involved with the mafia. and that there was a connection with JFK back there, but then JFK got rid of the Sinatra connection.
Because he wanted to distance himself from the mob?
Politically and otherwise, I think he just felt that he had outgrown the kind of like his father's styles.
Or maybe Sinatra wasn't useful to him anymore.
Maybe that's true too. And it is interesting later when Ronald Reagan is running and Ted Kennedy gets into the race, and all the news reporters say, to Frank Sinatra, aren't you supposed to be supporting the Kennedy family? And Sinatra standing there like, no, I'm with Reagan. It is kind of an interesting twist. Noguchi went back to the scene and he pointed out bullet holes in the wall. And they come to the conclusion, actually, that although Sirhan's gun holds 8 bullets, there are 13 bullets that are fired. So immediately you have a second gunman.
13.
Also, yes.
Okay. Is that the final number?
Yeah, that is the amount of bullets that are accounted for.
Okay.
That's the amount of bullet shots.
Mm-hmm.
Now, eventually, the Los Angeles police would get rid of that. The place in the walls. They would take the walls and bring them to headquarters and then get rid of them ultimately.
Right, there were door frames.
And then they would say like, oh, we're not sure those were bullet holes. We're just going with this official story. So Noguchi found himself in this unusual position of having the facts and the evidence and giving it to him and not really wanting to play into the politics of it, just telling them these are my findings. But he's creating a huge problem for them. And another big problem, as I showed you with his original drawing, is that the bullets that he's showing are all coming from the ground up. Take a real good look at that. He's showing them at this upward trajectory coming into him from the back and from the bottom, which means somebody down there is shooting up at the senator. Let's go back to the official story for a minute. Sirhan is a lonely loser. Have you heard about the lonesome loser? He's walking around. He's directionless. He decides now, they say, oh, RFK made some comment about supporting Israeli jets being bought and making this sale of Israeli jets. And so there's a news story about this, and that sets him off. And he goes and decides to do this. Very much like the phony Jack Ruby story, where they say, well, he heard that Jackie Kennedy would have to come to Dallas to do the trial, so he decided to kill Oswald. Well, no. That's just something that the newspaper said. And with Sirhan, it turns out that until he was in jail and heard from another inmate that there was going to be this sale of these planes, he never knew anything about it. So there's no motive in that sense. Certainly not the one that they presented. So now it really doesn't make sense. You've got no motive. And then also, how did he get in there? And how did he get in there to such a point to understand where when Kennedy leaves, he's going to be positioned perfectly to come in there and shoot? These things are not explained. What happens is researchers start to get even very early on. Like I said, a lot of the best research on this is done early on. They start to realize, oh, this whole thing is a sham. And they start to interview people who had seen somebody else shooting. And as time goes by, we start to see these people come forward. I actually want to play Noguchi speaking about this, so we get this on the record right away, so we all understand that Sirhan is not the shooter. Someone else is the shooter. Sirhan certainly fired shots and they ricocheted and hit people, like Schrade, for example. But the person who shot Kennedy was directly behind him and lower. Okay, so this first one is Noguchi talking about that and confirming his report.
I came to the conclusion that Senator Bobby Kennedy was shot by this small caliber gun from the right side of the back of the head, and about this the close range is such extent that I feel as perhaps 3 inches from the back of the ear, maybe even 1 inch. Now, I understand that the witnesses so far produced by the prosecution has not been able to find any witness seeing that such person as Sirhan, as Mr. Sirhan, was close to it. Of course, everybody in a panicky situation, so that this is outside of the realm of my investigation.
Okay, so Noguchi's pretty clear there. What he says is it's between 1 and 3 inches that the shot came from. The idea of what you're talking about with the witnesses in the police case and the way that they've presented it, that's outside of my expertise, but I can tell you from my own expertise what took place in terms of the actual shooting. So it's an enormous problem for the LAPD. And what they opt to do is get a confession from Sirhan with his lawyer telling him that you'll face the electric chair otherwise. And they close down the case as fast as possible. They don't do any further investigation. So there are a number of things around the case which are left hanging there, including unusual individuals, including all sorts of anomalies that night, which don't add up to the story that they put out. So we get into a situation there where we start to ask, why did they cover it up right off the bat? And if there were more people involved, then why weren't they investigating those people? They wanted this one scenario. In order to determine that, we have to look at some of the characters involved and what may have been advantageous for them to shut it down.
Gerald King says the ballroom at the Ambassador was loaded with Latin American CIA hitmen from Operation Condor. Are you going to address that at all?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting because somebody took this theory too far, Shane O'Sullivan, and he put out a movie and he basically did a documentary and he identified everyone from George Janides to David Morales there in the ballroom. But it turns out you didn't need, CIA agents aren't all going to get together and have a barbecue right in front of the cameras. However, there's a heavy CIA presence at this anyway, even though some of his conclusions were incorrect. And the conclusion, is that there's a heavy CIA presence and there's a deep state assassination to take place. When these things happen, a number of unusual characteristics show up. 1, there are unexplained people. 2, it seems like time itself has to change in order for their stories to fit. But 3, tonight we're going to bring forward some people who have not been really included in this conversation. And it's very important. Some of them come from in the employ of H.L. Hunt, who was a Texas oil man who employed a German intelligence network, which came directly out of the Nazis, post-Nazi World War II, and was a major opponent of the Kennedys very early on, and was looked at as somebody who really may have been involved in the original Kennedy assassination. What's strange, and that what I'm going to put on the record tonight, is that his lawyer has come out now so many years after his death and told the real story about their strange association around the RFK assassination. And we're going to get to that too. His name is John Curington, and we're going to be hearing from his direct testimony as well.
Okay.
Before I go any further, how are you doing out there, Ms.
Doing
Ford?
great.
Yeah.
Do you want another question?
Sure.
This one intrigued me. So Esoteric 369 Wall says, Daniel, where or how was it shown that MLK was going to be RFK's VP? I've heard that rumored. Is that a fact?
Oh, yeah, we've talked about that on this program.
Mm-hmm.
There are reports that the FBI was wiretapping both of them and that a lot of frenzied activity took off the week before the assassination because of conversations that they had tapped of MLK's. Now, the conversation idea is that he was saying, I'm going to support you, and that RFK, for his part, was saying to his own aides that he was going to take him on as VP. So this combination of circumstances, it may have only led to MLK supporting RFK, but if RFK had MLK's support going into the election, then all the Democratic resistance would go away, and basically it would be those two against Nixon, even if RFK had a different VP, and they would have won. I mean, I think he would have won, but to dramatically have that minority vote with him and the movement that MLK had, they certainly would have won. So this was a huge alarm bell. A worse alarm bell was RFK musing about putting MLK on the ticket. This set off alarm bells in that system. Remember, it's J. Edgar Hoover who's running the FBI at that point. He's already an enemy of the Kennedys and King. And he's also, you know, in the pocket of these deep state interests. So he's you know, performed in so many different assassinations. So that is that's a scenario that would have been unbelievable. If you think about where things were heading previous to MLK's assassination and then previous to Bobby Kennedy's assassination. And remembering that, as I said, Bobby Kennedy got into it very late. He got into the election in March. And then LBJ did the extraordinary thing of not running for a second term. Now, presidents do a lot of strange things in office, but not running for a second term, it never happens. And even Nixon, who had Watergate happening, ran for a second term. You know, you just don't, you may not win, but you've always run for a second term. So this was highly unusual. And the fact is that recognizing, as LBJ did, that they were going to have to put away RFK, that he couldn't be sitting there, the beneficiary of another Kennedy assassination. It would be too much.
Well, he didn't want to take the risk.
No. And it's, I mean, when you really look at that, him walking away at the end of March, it's a strange broadcast. And everyone at the time was shocked because they thought, hey, you know, this guy lusts for power. He gets in, he's going to keep it. But no, he says, I won't even accept it if you draft me. Which is quite extraordinary. That picture I was showing there was RFK on the trail, and he was starting to hit his stride. He was winning, and he had great people behind him, even though he had set up a real kind of shoestring campaign apparatus compared to that monster apparatus they had done in 1960 for JFK. He was kind of like, you know, this is the time, I'm going to do it, and even if we don't have great organization in these different places, we're still going to win. And in fact, they did in California, which was the biggest prize. And that really kind of sank it for McCarthy. And then Hubert Humphrey hadn't even got in yet. And he was, you know, kind of a dumpy vice president of the Happy Warrior.
Right. No charisma at all.
And he loses to Nixon. That's pretty hardcore. But I think with Hubert Humphrey, you know, it's amazing because when Robert Kennedy died, he called up Ted Kennedy and said, you know, when I get the nomination, I'll make you VP, or if you want, you can run as the nominee and I'll be your VP. And the Kennedys at that point had just had too much. And it was only next year that Chappaquiddick would happen and all the rest. So they really... it was quite a period for them. Interestingly enough, the Chappaquiddick happens on the same night as the moonshot. Isn't that?
I know, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's just, you know, you're in deep territory there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we are in episode X Series 90. And we're really going to go deep. And believe it or not, all the major themes from the X series, the UFO file, X technology, mystery schools, the deep state, they're all present tonight. Even my own investigation in this, I was shocked the level of the confluence of influences in this episode. So, and we're going to reveal a couple of things that are just off the charts in relation to this case and really blow it wide open. Courageous voices like RFK Jr. now going to bat for his dad's future. And the way that historians will remember this assassination, trying to get the truth on the record through very difficult circumstances. You know, the case is 52 years old. He has asked now for a new investigation. But what's fascinating is I went back and I had heard that Robert Kennedy had asked Eric Holder to reinvestigate the case. This is the actual letter that he sent to Eric Holder, asking him to investigate it in 2012. Here we are 8 years later. And I think that President Trump, with his Attorney General, Barr, should go into this case immediately and give us the truth on the RFK assassination. Here's what his letter wrote. Dear Mr. Attorney General, I hope you'll honor the request made by Paul Schrade in his accompanying letter. Paul was a close friend and advisor to my father. He was standing beside my father when Daddy was killed, and Paul was himself wounded by a bullet. With boundless energy and a clear mind, Paul continues to pursue my father's ideals, an endeavor to which he has devoted his life. He organized the support of my mother and my family, the building of the new Robert F. Kennedy Community Schools on the former Ambassador Hotel site, because they actually did scrap the hotel, and now that's a huge Kennedy Center.
It's a beautiful center.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Paul and his team are nationally prominent attorney and former U.S. Attorney Rob Bonnet strongly believe the new evidence is conclusive and requires a new investigation. I agree and support his request for a new investigation. September 25th, 2012. That's when they made that request.
And nothing's happened since?
They have not. They have not moved forward. The other thing that's interesting about this is Sirhan Sirhan's still alive. And when unusual things started to happen this fall, last fall, I'm going to explain this very unusual sequence of events. So September 11th, 2019 rolls around. And it's reported on RFK Jr.'s Instagram, which is a big Instagram, about 500,000 followers, that Thane Eugene Cesar, February 28th, 1942, September 11th, 2019, he's died. And this story starts to unfold, but this is what RFK said on his Instagram. Quote, Thane Eugene Cesar died today in the Philippines. Compelling evidence suggests that Cesar murdered my father on June 5th, 1968. Cesar, an employee in a classified section of Lockheed's Burbank facility, we're going to get into that and how it relates to the UFO file dramatically in a moment here, was moonlighting as a security guard at the Ambassador Hotel. In fact, he'd only gotten the job 3 days earlier. That's quite some setup. He had landed the job about 1 week earlier. Cesar waited in the pantry as my father spoke in the ballroom, then grabbed my father by the elbow and guided him toward Sirhan. With 77 people in the pantry, every witness said Sirhan was always in front of my father, 3 to 6 feet distance. Sirhan fired 2 shots toward my father before he was tackled. From under the dog pile, he emptied his 8-chamber revolver, firing 6 more shots in the opposite direction, 5 of them striking bystander and 1 going wild. By his own account, Cesar was directly behind my dad, holding his right elbow, with his top gun drawn, when my dad fell backwards on top of him. Cesar repeatedly changed his story about exactly when he drew his weapon. According to the coroner, Thomas Noguchi, all 4 shots that struck my father were contact shots fired from behind my dad. Again, this is RFK's Instagram. With the barrel touching or nearly touching his body, real close, right on top of you. Cesar sold his .22 to a co-worker weeks after the assassination, warning him that it had been used in a crime. Cesar lied to police, claiming that he disposed of the gun months before the assassination. Cesar was a bigot who hated the Kennedys for their advocacy of civil rights for blacks. I had plans to meet Thane Eugene Cesar in the Philippines last June. He demanded a payment of $25,000 through his agent, Dan Moldea. We're going to get into him too tonight. Ironically, Moldea penned a meticulous and compelling indictment of Cesar in a 1995 book, and then suddenly exculpated him by fiat in a bizarre, nonsensical final chapter. This is crucial. Police have never seriously investigated Cesar's role in my father's killing, and that's true. As a matter of fact, although he was a security guard with his gun drawn, they never checked his gun, which is absurd in any crime scene. But this is such a breakthrough that RFK Jr. had made by putting this out. Now, let's take a quick look at Moldea. Moldea had done all these books about, Jimmy Hoffa and saying he's going deep into the assassinations and RFK and all these different things. And then...
So he was a researcher. Like an independent researcher?
He was an independent researcher, and he'd been around for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd done, interesting books. Out of nowhere, suddenly, in this book, he starts talking about what a great guy Thane Eugene Cesar is, and how actually he is the godfather of his children. So we're in very strange territory right off the bat.
Wait a second, hold on. Moldea didn't live, Caesar lived in the Philippines?
He moved to the Philippines.
Okay.
He had been in
Moldea
California
didn't,
for years.
right? Usually you have a godfather, a godparent somewhere that they can
That's
have a
true.
relationship with your children.
Yes, absolutely.
Weird. Okay.
There's no question about it. And the way that I look at that is whatever that agreement was, Moldea now suddenly, gets into this whole different viewpoint on anything. It's like,
is Moldea still alive?
and that Sirhan is the one, and, even after knowing all this stuff from doing, he's alive. And as a matter of fact, he's a big Hillary Clinton supporter, and he was big on the Russian collusion story and all that. So, instantly right off the bat, we find ourselves in unusual territory. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. Here we are in X series 90, going deep into the RFK assassination. The real facts, the breakthrough information is coming forward tonight. And it's an incredible story because, as I said, there are so many threads in it that tie directly into our research. There's such a huge aerospace aspect to this. And the assassination with those deep state fingerprints, and how we can tonight lay to rest the false story of Sirhan Sirhan coming in there as a disgruntled person being upset about Palestinians getting the shaft from the Israelis, and that Kennedy was in favor of this. That story goes out the window. It's just not true. But the idea of who Sirhan was is even more mind-blowing, because as we get into the connections around this, we're going to see exactly how it was set up. And it is mind-boggling. I kid you not. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter there. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps you in touch with us. It lets you know what guests we have coming up. We've had some great guests lately. Roger Stone was a breakthrough interview, and he is right now, his prison date is June 30th. So he has a very short period of time to do a Hail Mary and get a Trump pass there. And then RFK Jr. on medical tyranny. What an incredible interview. I want to tell everyone that I've left the link to the RFK Jr. interview in the description. And when you're done with this episode, you can watch that if you haven't already. It is extraordinary. And he goes deep on Gates and what Gates owns, and Fauci, and just on this whole CDC kind of nightmare, the medical tyranny that they're moving forward at rapid speed. And the kind of creation of this nanotech in these vaccines, just completely off the charts. The tracking devices is really a better name for them. I know Fitz has been doing that. She said, let's call them injectable tracking devices. That way you don't even have to deal with the vaccine questions, because these things are in a totally different league. It's not just, oh my God, they're going to put mercury in my system, and I'm going to get Alzheimer's or cancer or something is going to happen to my child. Now it's, they're injecting me with an updatable technological tag. So, they're moving. This is what the COVID op was about and where they were moving. So many of these things have come out that if we can get RFK Jr.'s voice out there, along with the Children's Health Defense Organization that he has founded, then we're going to get this information out to a larger public. And, that information is so well sourced that I think people are going to take to that. And it's just a matter that they've been under an incredible blackout from this mainstream media. One of the things that RFK Jr. pointed out in that interview is that, Pfizer is a direct sponsor of Anderson Cooper, directly, as an individual reporter. Can you imagine that? That would be like me sitting here and not just running commercials, but, a company coming forward and saying like, hey, Microsoft personally sponsors Dark Journalist Daniel List. This is extraordinary that we allow these things to happen and then expect these people are going to, how can they then individually and objectively report on a company like Pfizer or Merck if they're being sponsored. Lester Holt is sponsored by Merck.
Right. The other thing is, why do they need it? I mean, aren't they paid enough? What the hell is this
Exactly.
that you just sell your soul
Well,
to
Anderson
some
Cooper has
Mhm.
all the Vanderbilt money. Not to mention, I'm sure the CIA keeps these guys very much in the greenbacks. But that interview is just under an hour, and it is really one for the record book. So I highly recommend it. There's a section in there on Thane Eugene Cesar as well, and RFK's impressions on that. It's very important because it is his father that we're talking about, and he's very close to the case in terms of giving that information. So quite remarkable. Yes.
I got a good question from JJK. Okay. Have you ever thought about interviewing Sirhan Sirhan, or would they stop you? It's never come up as.
Well, it's very interesting. This is what I hear about Sirhan, which is that you can't get an interview with him currently. And I have talked to sources around him. But that's the word that I hear. Now, it is a fact that RFK Jr. went to visit him and questioned him and came away more convinced than ever that he was not the assassin that they had made him out to be. Now, we saw this also with the family of MLK when they had gone and visited James Earl Ray. All the information that they had was the same as well, which is, the FBI and the deep state were basically after MLK, and they had kind of propped up this patsy. Now, I've done something very interesting with these patsy investigations, which is I'm showing that there are aerospace connections and X technology, advanced technology connections to each of them. I started in episode 89 to do this, mentioning the Pascagoula case in relation to James Earl Ray. And that is significant. So what is going to happen is this is going to serve as another point in that investigation. And it is episode 91 where we're going to draw in the X-Tech UFO connections. But I'm going to show them tonight because they're there. They're unmistakably there. And it's quite a breakthrough to look at these things from this level because we've been pursuing it on this level. But to have that information coming forward now, it is remarkable. And as it comes up tonight, it is going to be the TKO, as I always say.
I can't wait for what's next.
Now, we can, before I go into the next section, you can roll if you have something.
Ed Kaufman was asking if Robert Mayhew and his relationship with Howard Hughes comes up in this episode.
Yes.
Ah.
It's front and center.
Okay.
As you know, I've been in touch with the family of John Meyer, who is Howard Hughes' bookkeeper. And he's still alive. And he came forward with something called Age of Secrets in 2015. Now, Meyer is a very key person because he was there, and in his diary, it's listed how Mayhew had organized the RFK assassination. Mayhew was the partner of Howard Hughes, but he never met him, which is very unusual. Mayhew was a CIA operator, and he was someone who was close with people like Johnny Roselli, who were that interplay of organized crime and the CIA. Now, oddly enough, we're going to find characters like Roselli and Mayhew all come up tonight as we move along. And it's quite fascinating when we think about it, because when you get into that interplay of intelligence with organized crime, that's one kind of a jaw-dropping scenario, but we know it, we're familiar with it. When you get into the organized crime intelligence aspect around the aerospace advanced tech aspects with black projects, then we're really into the territory of the X series, but it is like nothing else that's out there. And what's fascinating to me is I talk with great RFK researchers, JFK researchers. They do not understand that they understand so many meticulous details about deep state operations, the CIA. They know how that aspects work. But they don't understand the aerospace aspects. And this is very fascinating because if you look at the documents that were held back during the CIA document some of the main documents they kept back on October 26, 2017, were these documents dealing with Jim Garrison's investigation Jim Garrison admitted to the editor at Ramparts magazine that what he found was that from chasing down all of these leads, that he had felt he had been wrong. And this is 1968, that it wasn't just this Texas oil man, kind of political end, but that the heart of the conspiracy was in aerospace, in the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex. We have to keep that in mind, because that's the only person who tried to prosecute an actual case on the books in relation to the Kennedy assassination. So what is it about aerospace? What is that secret? What is the advanced technology part? Those great researchers on the JFK, RFK, MLK side, even the ones who've gone into John Lennon and these other MKUltra assassinations, they don't look, it's an uncomfortable thing, and it's been made uncomfortable by the media, looking into the UFO aspect, looking into that UFO black budget advanced tech aspect. And they don't want to throw out all their legitimacy to all these political investigators, so they don't go near it. But you can't, in my opinion, you cannot get to the heart of these assassinations and the shape of American culture without going directly into the heart of the group I call X-Protect, which is that's the intelligence wing that handles that protection of that advanced technology. And that advanced technology gets us directly into the UFO file. It's just, there's no way around it. And when we're looking at it, it's also true that a lot of the UFO researchers are not as meticulous as these political researchers. So that's also a problem, because you have these great researchers on one side who can track down the deep state assassinations. They're highly meticulous. And then you have people on the other side studying the UFO aspect, the advanced tech aspect, and they get into very overhyped scenarios or intel scenarios like TTSA, for example. So you're always dealing with a TV show, it's History Channel's TTSA, what do they call that terrible show? Unidentified, that's the show. And it has Elizondo, the CIA agent, walking around and being disgruntled because he's trying to get the truth out, Elizondo is, he's a CIA operative who worked directly for John Brennan and James Clapper. Those are intel people who hide secrets. And so that organization as a whole has over 100 years of CIA experience. It's a CIA op. So, that's not anywhere near what we need to get to when we're looking at these things. And so somehow bringing these worlds together about good research around the aerospace aspect, the X technology that's involved here, and then bringing that together with the good deep state, the kind of Peter Dale Scott deep state research, that's how you get to a new plateau. And it's not going to be, through the kind of fluff that you're seeing in the UFO side. Okay.
By the way, every
Yes.
other tweet that I see
Yes. It's about
is about Project Bluebeam, Operation Bluebeam.
Ah.
So it's out there. Everybody thinks that's going to be the next op.
This is very interesting to me. Here's the thing. Bluebeam, really, if you think about it, the originator of the idea, the term comes a little later, but the originator of the idea is Werner von Braun. And that's in his discussions, private discussions with Carol Rosen, where he says they're going to do these various steps. One of those steps involves blocking asteroids. One of those steps involves fighting terrorists. And they're going to keep making these excuses to make the military machine that much bigger. But the final one is this alien invasion idea. That's Werner von Braun from NASA, the paperclip Nazi scientist that we brought over here to become the father of our space program. So it's pretty remarkable. And we've done a show on it with Professor Farrell, or Dr. Farrell, on this. The way I look at it is it has to be looked at. And if you look at the New York Times article and how TTSA and groups like this like to portray the threat aspect over and over again, when we see that, we know you're being manipulated because it's a threat. You need a response to the threat. Therefore, you need to create a government apparatus inside the military against this threat. And they're going to use that threat just like they used the terrorist threat or the COVID threat, the incredible shrinking virus threat. Yes.
Well, I mean, I'm always like, let's, cut to the chase. I mean, what they are creating with Space Force
Yes.
and all the satellites and all of this, I mean, they are creating a total global surveillance grid. What I find
Space
amazing,
Force is very important
Mhm.
in this. No, go ahead.
Well, I just, people are not connecting the dots correctly when they look at it. They're not seeing how COVID is playing into the riots and where this is all leading.
Yes.
At underground bunkers. And I was just made aware of a Pentagon leaked video from 2016 about mega cities, which very much look like Soylent Green.
Yes.
And I think this is what they want to avoid, a planet that is devastated environmentally and overpopulated. And they think that's where we're headed. At least that's what they talk about amongst themselves.
So you're saying if they can get rid of us, basically have us fight each other off.
This is Agenda 21. This is the Georgia Guidestones, is that what they want is to control us, chip us, track us, and then they want to grade us like they do in China.
As a kind of social credit system.
Yes, so that we're going to have a score for our IQ, our looks, our health, all of that, our usefulness to society. And when you dip down past a certain point, you're going to be disposed of.
Well, what's interesting? There's a lot of this in the RFK Jr. interview, interestingly enough. There's how you're going to be tracked to the point where you can't do this, you can do that, and your money can be shut off in a heartbeat. The Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is supposed to be for our benefit. Just like when the computers came out, they were for our benefit. What they want to do is turn it around and just make us a kind of AI consumer inside, a piece of this thing. The way I look at it is there's a series of steps that have happened that have brought us into this point. And, when they developed a kind of secret space program over the course of the last 50 years and how that interfaces with the continuity of government program. Now, I have to mention here, before we get back to the details of the 52nd anniversary of the RFK assassination, that Northcom General Commander Terrence O'Shaughnessy was trotted out again as soon as all of this riot stuff happened. And there he was, and there they were talking about how there's a special unit of continuity of government which got drawn up because of the COVID thing, and that he was the commander that they were answering to. Now, they had laid off on that, but I think whenever they go into that, it is a subtle threat against the current occupant in the White House, and they're setting up a scenario where, Fitz talked about this. Actually, it's pretty interesting what she was talking about, because in relation to the criticism that James Mattis came out with recently, who was like a Trump man and was coming out and saying this, she, along with Sybil Edmonds, she was taking from Sybil Edmonds, who was getting this intel. And some people have been getting this intel that the military is on the verge of staging something anti the president, and that they are thinking of, working with this coalition of politicians. And there are people in that mix, like Romney and like Obama, that I think it's worth paying attention to. And certainly Secretary Catherine Austin Fitz felt like it was worth paying attention to. So it's something we're going to keep our eye on. I also want to mention that in relation to all the things that are happening, when we get at the root and we pull at the process that got us here. So if we look at something like the 1968 election and we start to ponder how we got here in 2020 with them just rolling out these ops and the deep state on overdrive, the deep state had to take a tremendous risk in order to remove President Kennedy and then Robert Kennedy and MLK. But they succeeded, and they were able to build themselves off of this. And they've left behind a lot of questions. And the vast majority of the public does not believe in the JFK official story. Now the RFK official story, thank God, it's coming to light. That one's starting to collapse. And the MLK story was always shaky ground. So these are such cornerstone stories of American development that the way that I look at the 60s is that a civil war did take place between the deep state and the public state, and the deep state won. And that we've been trying to get that power back, and that even people like Nixon, who were part of this, turned against the process, and they had to be gotten rid of as well. Everyone, we're deep in X Series 90. We're going into the 52nd anniversary of the RFK assassination at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in 1968. And one of the things I want to point out is that that incident, when you think of the difference between having RFK as president in 1968 election and then going into 69, and how that would have been 8 years of Kennedy running things from 69 to 77, the world would have been a very, very different place. Instead, we got a lot more Vietnam, a lot more of these different things that happened. And
well, it's death profiteering. That's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and also I think that we're looking at a scenario where, the Vietnam War, the way that it stretched out, and it didn't really end until 1975. It's an incredibly long war, and it went on, from the very beginning. It went on too long, but certainly from 1968, when everyone was promising to end it, to have it go on for another 7 years is remarkable. So we have to see the impact of this assassination. Now we're going to look at some of the players behind it and some of the unusual, even occult aspects around this crime. I was thinking that what we should do here.
I'd love to ask this one question.
Sure.
Okay, Judy Riley is asking, was Sirhan involved in a mystery school?
He was indeed. He was indeed. And we're going to get to that. There's both a theosophical and a Rosicrucian connection. And then we come face to face also with Manly P. Hall, which I'm going to read directly from the researcher who found that out. But one of the kind of crucial things I think we see in the X series work and some of the things that we're looking at here is that the mystery school aspect and the X-Tech aspect is not very well understood in traditional literature around these things. And that whenever, like I think I was describing this divide earlier, if we can get that understanding around the mystery schools and around the X-Tech locked in with the deep state research, it'll be an incredible, powerful body of work the way that we're doing it here. So let's take a look at a few of these. These are pictures now of Thane Eugene Cesar, who we're looking at now as the assassin of Senator Kennedy, who was on his way to becoming the second President Kennedy in 1968. This is actually the card showing that who was on the camera here. That is Thane Eugene Cesar walking around before the assassination inside of the hotel. And you can look and see here that the hotel's identifying him as Thane Cesar in uniform. And on the bottom, they say Lockheed Aircraft. Take a good look at that. Now, that picture is very interesting because we get a snapshot of him and what he was doing there in his role in security. And remember that he was only there starting 3 days before the assassination. So he was positioned kind of last minute. There's another shot from the same type of camera angle. Thane Eugene Cesar was from California, and something very remarkable about him is going to come out tonight. I also want to say in relation to Cesar that before he died, as we were showing there, RFK Jr. was in negotiations to have him come out and confess. And he was talking to him about it. And RFK Jr. was going to head to the Philippines to meet with him and get him to tell his story for real. Eugene Cesar was in his 80s, and I think he was looking back at everything, and he was thinking, maybe I can do this and it won't have a bad impact on my family, and how can I get this out? Now, we've already seen the weird cover-up in Moldea and all these aspects. We have touched on them, although there are deeper levels there. This is the last picture of Thane Eugene Cesar before his death. And this is somebody who had been walking around with this for years, but he had been used, it turns out, in different situations by Mayhew and by Hughes. And we're going to put that on the record tonight, too, as well as being a CIA contract agent. This is an actual shot of Thane Eugene Cesar during the shooting with his gun drawn.
Wow.
It's unmistakable. He changed his story multiple times. Later, he would say he drew his gun after the shooting started. But that is the actual gunshot. Gunshot picture, gun photo.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just that's another piece of that shot. Here's a quote from a local newsman who saw Cesar shooting. His name is Don Schulman, and I have an audio quote from him that we're going to get into in a minute here. He says, quote, "I was standing behind Kennedy. I saw a man pull out a gun. It looked like he pulled it out from his pocket and shot 3 times. That's Sirhan that he's referring to, I assume. I saw all 3 shots hit the senator. Then I saw the senator fall, and he was picked up and carried away. I also saw the security men pull out their weapons. After then, it was very, very fuzzy." He saw security men pull out their weapons, even more than just Cesar, apparently. What's interesting is there are other witnesses who say that the security people were firing. Now, it's crucial because of what Noguchi saw in terms of the autopsy. He's looking at the bullets coming from the bottom up towards Kennedy's neck. And therefore, it's somebody crouching down below and behind Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. Now, let's get a couple more pictures on this going. When we look at Thane Eugene Cesar's official story, what he says is that, I didn't know what was going on, and I fell down. And what's interesting is there are pictures, and I have the picture here that it's connected with, but we can't actually see the tie. This shot of Senator Kennedy on the ground, in his hand, close to him, he is holding the necktie of Thane Eugene Cesar.
Wow.
Which he grabbed, and it was one of those clip-on ties that came off during the incident. Now, what's fascinating about this for me is when I look at it, I think about him going down, and then I think about what Thane Eugene Cesar is saying that, I fell down when the shooting started and I went to get my gun. So he's already in a position where he has to shoot up. So he's already in a weird way confessing as to his position. Because we have to think about this. Now, there is a height difference there with Cesar and Kennedy that would account for him if he's shooting up at him. When the police get there, they just know that he's security and they let him off. They never check his gun, but they notice he has powder burns on his face, which means gunfire has been going by closely. And they just assume, he's in the middle of all this Sirhan shooting. I guess that those gunpowder burns on his face must just be from that. For some reason, they let him off, and I think it's very important because they understand that he's connected with a much larger organization, or their superiors tell him, let him go. Sirhan, on the other hand, is instantly grabbed because he's the one who's made a full nuisance of himself. What's very strange, and what some of the traditional researchers into this case can tell you, like William Turner and people of this ilk, is that the gun that Sirhan uses changes its code, its serial number, between the time the police have it and by the time it's presented at trial.
I've never heard that.
And also that the bullets that they have from the gun, they don't use the bullets that are fired at the trial. What they give the gun to a grand jury, and so they fire their own bullets with a gun that's like his. So that's also very, very unusual in any kind of a case. And the lawyer right off the bat is telling the prosecution, we're going to plead guilty and we're not going to give you any trouble. So there's no investigation, and therefore this whole thing can be covered over quite dramatically. Now, how did you get Sirhan into this situation in the first place? How does he end up at the Ambassador Hotel with a gun in his hand firing away? Because of the explosive nature of the bullets coming out of his gun, a lot of people who have researched the case have felt that those were blanks that he was firing. And there is actually no evidence that he was firing bullets at all. This is the unusual thing about the gun and the bullets in this case. The case, as far as a real investigation, is one of the worst I've ever seen. And any of the researchers who've gone deep on it will show you that the LAPD just covered it up. They wanted it to go down a certain way. Now, we're going to look into a few unusual aspects of Sirhan Sirhan, and then we're going to look into who his programmer was, because this is a crucial piece of information that's come to light. First of all, this is the book that he was reading at the time of the assassination. It's called Cyclomancy, The Secret of Psychic Power Control. This book talks a lot about mental power, getting what you want, using psychic power, but it instantly displays a kind of mystical mindset on the person who has it. They're interested in psychic aspects. They're interested in occult factors. In the famous notebook that Sirhan writes, RFK must die, and they find all of that stuff is obtained without a warrant. So therefore, they could be using notes, they could be hiding other stuff, they could be inventing the thing whole cloth. But in any case, if you knew there was going to be a trial, and if you knew that you were going to have to prosecute this guy, you'd get a warrant for it, and then you would go to his apartment and get the stuff. Instead, they just went for it. Again, very unusual. In his notebook, he talks about a number of unusual things. One of the things that he pulls out here is the name of Master Kutumi. Now, anyone who's watched this program and seen the Theosophical shows knows a heck of a lot about Master Kutumi. That is one of the masters in the Theosophical literature that Madame Blavatsky interacts with. And
is that her primary guide?
Well, certainly one of the major ones, yes. And what's interesting also is that Kutumi has, a reverence factor in theosophy. It's the ultimate in a sense. There's Lord Maria, they all have these different ones. But what's fascinating to me when I look at it is I'm looking and seeing this connection directly to the mystery schools inside of this assassination case. And he's writing it down in his own hand. So it's not somebody saying, this is Sirhan, and he was around at Theosophical groups, maybe. He's writing Master Kutumi. Now, what's interesting is in hypno-programming, you have to use a symbol in order to get a person to say that he's doing something for somebody. So in hypnotic programming, you can say, for example, that this master is coming to you and giving you these instructions. They could have been imitating Kutumi and saying, he wants you to go to this place, buy a gun, and fire on a range. And that would be the hypnotic program to give him this kind of soft idea of the stuff that he's getting into. How he gets into this is quite interesting, because there's a period when we go into Sirhan's history, they call it the fog, which is 3 months where he's missing from the record. His family doesn't know where he is. His friends don't know where he is. There's no record of him anywhere.
Weird. Who coined it the fog?
That's a good question. The early literature looking at it calls it the fog period.
It's a cool name.
Because the original investigators, even the FBI, couldn't figure this out.
So it's like missing time.
Yeah. So he's being trained. He's being schooled. What happens is he shows up later in Corona, California. And there he is. One of the guys he's hanging out with is into this occult stuff. And suddenly he starts going and taking part in theosophical meetings. This is Sirhan. And he becomes a member of AMORC, which is a kind of a knockoff group of the Rosicrucians. It's the American version. In here, you might notice, this is part of his notebook, that it says over here, illuminate Illuminati. This overused term now, we see Illuminati, but back then you didn't see Illuminati that much. Almost nobody wrote about it. And here he is talking about it directly in his own work. And these Star of Davids everywhere are the theosophical logo without, the extra accoutrement, but there it is. So we're deep now in the heart of the mystery school activity, AMORC, the Rosicrucians, the Theosophical Society, Master Khatumi. So these are the symbols that he's working with. Now we're going to look at that fog period and come to the conclusion that he's being programmed. And maybe the people who are programming him are giving him this occult input. And maybe that's how he's finding himself in these different situations. And maybe what he's basically being instructed, which is that, he's going to become one of these ascended masters. Or he's going to get to meet one. Or he's going to become...
Well, everybody wants to meet them, right?
Ain't that the truth? Another thing I want to put on the record, and I'll double back on this, which is, like the Oswald case, and like some of these other cases, there are doubles everywhere when it comes to Sirhan. At the actual event, there's someone named David Wayne who has a definite resemblance, let's say, to Sirhan Sirhan, and he shows up unexpectedly in RFK's suite, but RFK is not there. But this guy has all kinds of access, and he shows up here, and he's holding this, looks like, sign my poster or whatever, but it's also unusual gear for somebody to be holding around a presidential candidate. You could pull a gun out, you could do all kinds of things. So it's a very loose situation that this person is coming around and making himself known, but also resembling our friend Sirhan quite a bit. And both of them, Wayne and Sirhan, will be seen earlier, May 24th, at an event in San Diego where RFK is speaking. More of a stadium-style event. People remember seeing them there, but together again. We know that the researchers put Sirhan together with a very attractive woman, and that later this woman runs away with a dark-complexioned man who kind of looks like Sirhan but isn't, and that they say, we shot Kennedy, and the girl in the polka dot dress becomes that accessory figure. It looks very much like whoever that was also seen with Sirhan the week before the assassination leading up, that he was seen in the presence of this very attractive woman. So keep that in mind as we move forward into this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X series, X-90. And we're going deep into the root breakthrough of the RFK assassination. Some of the things in tonight's episode are absolutely mind-boggling, and the case screams out for a new investigation. As I've said, a lot of good RFK investigators have put that on the map, and RFK Jr. himself has requested it from the Attorney General. And I imagine that an Attorney General request is just sitting there for Barr, and I highly recommend that the current administration take up that same call. One of the things I want to mention before we get into the programmer is that in the notebook, a lot of hypnotherapists who were early on in the case and psychologists, one of them was named Dr. Diamond, he looked at Sirhan and said he was one of the most hypnotizable people he'd ever met. He was so suggestible. And he gave him a suggestion within a few minutes of saying that he was a monkey. And as soon as he said that, you monkey, you have the ability to climb like a monkey, Sirhan started to climb the jail bars. So he was instantly impressionable, and this may have been his special quality. As these patsies, each one of them has some special ability. But he's highly suggestible. when they go deep into this case of his mind, when the psychologists are trying to get in there, one of the strange things that comes out in those notebooks is that he's saying things over and over again. And he's saying odd things like, make sure it's pay to the order of. And he talks about being afraid. And in traditional programming, when you're trying to make someone do something, you can scare them and you can make them, deprive them of certain things, deprive them of water, deprive them of food. And if you read those notebooks with an eye toward that type of programming, then the notebooks themselves open up quite a bit. Now, before we get into the programmer, there's this little piece on the side of the Theosophical Society. Let's see. Here we go. In late 1967, Sirhan inexplicably dropped from sight. Veteran LAPD officer, this is from the book, The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy by William Turner, who's an ex-FBI agent. A veteran LAPD officer who wishes to remain anonymous told us that SUS in tracing Sirhan's activities during the year preceding the assassination wound up with a 3-month gap in his whereabouts. A neighbor of the Sirhan family advised the FBI that Mary Sirhan, his mother, became extremely worried when her son left home, and she did not know his whereabouts for quite some time. This is when it happened, late 1967. And then remember, it's mid-1968 when he's going to be doing this. When he returned, Sirhan's interest in the occult had deepened. He haunted a Pasadena bookstore specializing in occult subjects. Now he's gone into this occult theme in a very big way. Let's see if I have a picture of him here in that period. Oh, that's his handler. Okay. Now, in March 1968, he appeared at a Theosophical Society meeting in Pasadena. This is crucial. Although he curtly refused to identify himself, he also became a member of the Rosicrucian Order, paying dues, and in late May, before the assassination, attended a meeting of the Pasadena Lodge of Rosicrucians, AMORG. These holy tentative links with Theosophists and Rosicrucians set the stage for the propaganda theatrics immediately following the shooting, in which Mayor Sam Yorty branded the Rosicrucians a, quote, communist organization.
Whoa.
This is really unusual. What happens, too, with this mayor is very interesting, because it turns out that Manly P. Hall has met with Sirhan Sirhan, because Sirhan Sirhan went to his center there. And so this guy stops blowing the whistle on Rosicrucians and Theosophical Society and saying that they're communists, because it turns out that Manly P. Hall, who is this, incredible mystical writer who wrote The Secret Teachings of All Ages.
Some kind of initiate.
Oh, no question about it. He's actually the guru for the mayor at the time. So the guy realizes, wait a minute, I'm going to make myself sound like a communist if I keep this up. So let's keep going. Mayor Sam Yorty branded the Rosicrucians a communist organization, and Steinbacher and Hilder implied, this is the researchers, that the Theosophists had exerted a sinister influence over Sirhan. It's pretty unusual, laying the blame there at the mystery school doorstep. Conveniently, they admitted the fact that a police search of Sirhan's car yielded a volume entitled Healing the Divine Art by Manly P. Hall, founder of the Philosophical Research Society. The book mysteriously disappeared from the grand jury exhibits. Hall, a man with penetrating eyes, chiseled features, Buddha-like figure, was a master hypnotist with practice in hypnotherapy. Some time ago, he had gained considerable publicity from hypnotic antics, on one occasion putting under a movie actor and convincing him he was suffocating, with the result that the actor tore apart a movie set in his frantic search for air. I want to say this about Manly P. Hall. They're making him sound like, Aleister Crowley II. He actually is a very advanced teacher, highly spiritual, And he sometimes, in his demonstrations with the things I think they're talking about here, it was all about getting people to understand the deeper aspects of the qualities of their mind. He was not somebody who was sinister with hypnosis or anything like that. However, the fact that he was a master hypnotist and that he met Sirhan shows that Sirhan is attracted to this element. Somehow the hypnosis part is a deep thing that he wants to figure out. Meaning those 3 months where he disappeared, he may have come under the influence of this CIA programmer. I'm going to show you who the programmer was, and we're going to get into this by his own admission. We queried Sirhan and Sam Quinton about Manly P. Hall and his society. He wrote back that he remembered paying several visits to the headquarters in Alabaster Temple near Griffith Park. The secretary there had a distinct foreign accent, he said. Manly P. Hall's wife is German-born. I had to ask her to unlock the bookcases for me to get the books I wanted to read in the library. I remember seeing Manly P. Hall himself there. Sirhan's dabbling with the occult society is by itself innocuous, but there's a certain irony in the fact that he was drinking from the same mystical fountain as Sam Yorty. For some 2 decades, the mayor had been a student of Hall, whom he regarded as his guru. So now we're in very interesting kind of crossfire mystical territory with this. They go deeper themselves, and they find something, William Turner and his co-author, they find something about Sirhan in that diary that didn't add up. They call it a diary. It's really more like a notebook. The notebook's containing Sirhan's automatic writing. Could he have scrawled something during a trance regression that the hypnotist had mentioned while programming him? There was a passage that stood out because it was unlike the others, having nothing to do with horses, politics, money, or past acquaintances. It read, God help me, please help me. Salvo, di salvo, die es salvo. The reference apparently was to Albert de Salvo, the notorious Boston Strangler. That case had been cracked by the use of hypnotism, and the hypnotist was Dr. William Joseph Bryan Jr. of Los Angeles, who ran the American Hypnosis Foundation. Now, Bryan billed himself as the leading expert in the world on the use of hypnosis. Now, what's interesting about Bryan is he's a very, very unusual character, but his name bothered me right off the bat because I was thinking, well, there's this famous political figure from the turn of the century. His name was William Jennings Bryan, and this guy was strange enough. That's William Jennings Bryan, and he is, in fact, the great-grandfather of this other William Bryan. And he's also the father of the first female ambassador, and their whole family is very, very unusual. This Bryan was also very unusual. These are some shots of him, and during the Cold War, he was used for Project Artichoke and MKUltra by the CIA to see what they could condition different responses to, including the development of a Manchurian candidate. In fact, he was the person who was the consultant to the director, John Frankenheimer, on the Manchurian Candidate movie. This is him in the 70s when he would die in 1977, which is very interesting for a few reasons, because he was identified in a book in 1977 as being the programmer of Sirhan, and a few unusual things happened. One of the things that's odd about this guy is immediately after Sirhan, quote unquote, assassinates Robert Kennedy, he goes on a radio station and talks about how Sirhan could have been under hypnotic effect and how the whole thing could have been done in a trance. Now, it's on a radio show on the night of the assassination. He gets called in like an expert. But it is, in a sense, the ultimate cover, because if you were really responsible for it, you'd think you'd be miles and miles away. But if you're right there in the heart of it, telling everyone how hypnosis works and how that he could be a victim of hypnosis, you are kind of self-identifying there. He's a very unusual character, and some of his antics get into a lot of like strange sexual perversions involving hypnosis. And in his,
we want stories.
It's a long story. In his, this is another weird picture of him. In his, he's living in Beverly Hills, which I find interesting if you were tapping into the last issue, which is Litton Industries, the military contractor, is in Beverly Hills. But here we are with Jennings, and he is now, Bryan, he is in Las Vegas, and he's seeing these hookers on a regular basis. And he's seeing them over the course of several years. So the House Assassination Committee comes out, which is on the JFK assassination, but it makes things politically tense. And then word starts to spread that maybe Sirhan had a programmer. Boom, this guy dies of a heart attack. He was only 50 years old. And the police interview the two hookers in Las Vegas. And they talked to him about what he talked about. And he said, well, I was in on all these cases. Now, one thing I should mention right off the bat is he was in the DeSalvo case. He's the one who put DeSalvo into trance and made him remember and confess to being the Boston Strangler. Now, so many people who knew DeSalvo said, not in a million years would that guy be the Boston Strangler. And yet, DeSalvo meets his match here. They send this guy in, probably to wrap up DeSalvo as a patsy for those crimes. And boom, he confesses there's no trial. There's no discovery. He's in. So he's called in on these high-level cases. And when we look at Bryan, we're looking at someone who has honed his technique through MKUltra. By 1973, Richard Helms comes forward just before he gets fired as CIA director, and he demands his assistant burn all the activity relating to MKUltra, which is all psychological programming, the development of assassins for various purposes, and mental manipulation on an individual and a public scale. But we never know, even though we hear a lot about MKUltra, the truth is we never know a great deal about it because most of the records are burned. But here he is, a practicing adept. The thing that he brags to with these hookers is he talks to them about these cases that he's involved in, and out of nowhere, he tells them, I was the one who programmed Sirhan Sirhan to assassinate Robert Kennedy.
And he's bragging like it's a turn on for him and for them.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, when we think about the unusual character, this is the cover of one of his books, The Psychology of Jury Selection, The Chosen Ones, William Bryan. Very unusual. We get a little Adam and Eve scenario there. Let's go a little bit deeper with him. This is a shot of his great-great-grandfather, or his great-grandfather, actually. That's William Jennings Bryan. Interesting that he came through this fast track on the family, and that's an incredibly ambitious political family, almost to the level of the Kennedys in terms of the different office holders that they have in the family, including in Illinois and in Michigan and in Missouri. Now, what's fascinating, too, is that William Jennings Bryan is supposed to become president in 1908, but he is defeated by Taft, who is Roosevelt's handpicked a successor. Now, what's interesting is when Woodrow Wilson comes in 4 years later, he picks him as Secretary of State. So although he never gets the presidency, he's right there at that level. And that family has so many deep roots that I think when we're looking at Bryan, we're looking at a political, he's someone who's deep, deep in the milieu of the political bloodlines. Now, Sirhan, as we've seen attested to by so many, is that he is in fact easy to hypnotize. He's an easy subject. Somewhere along the line, probably when he came in looking into these different occult places, he ran across a hypnotist, and somehow he got linked with Bryan. If what Bryan said to his prostitutes is true, it makes all the sense in the world. One, he was in Los Angeles. He was in Beverly Hills. And what's fascinating about that is so was Litton Industries, who we got into extensively in episode 89. So now we have there, sitting in the middle of this Hollywood infrastructure, major military contractors and major MKUltra programmers. And then later, all these MKUltra stories come spilling out of Hollywood. The interface starts to make a lot of sense. Now, we're going to go back to Bryan shortly, but what I want to do here is I want to go and look at the operations behind the assassination to see how the actual players, how it was actually accomplished. And that's going to get us into Hughes and Mayhew and this very big revelation on the part of H.L. Hunt's lawyer. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in episode X-90. This is the RFK assassination, and it is unexpurgated. We are going deep on this to get the breakthrough answers, and we know that some of those answers RFK Jr. has brought forward himself and asked the Attorney General for a new investigation, and that's something that we should get wholly behind, because this is something that needs to happen. And what's interesting about this case, unlike others, is that Sirhan is still alive, which means we still have access to him. Ultimately, he could be hypnotized to find out how he was programmed. And this is probably something that should be a big object of the new investigation as well. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and make sure that you sign up for our newsletter. That is a way to keep us in touch. Like, everyone who's doing any important work is getting thrown off social media left and right. And we had a few even this week, right? And people who talk or go to talk about the things that are happening right now, if you go to talk about riots or COVID or any of the other ops that have been going down, they make it, they're saying, well, that doesn't agree with our community guidelines, just because they don't want people talking about these things, because God forbid they might find out the truth about what's really happening. So therefore, it's important that we have that direct pipeline with each other and make sure that we have that going on. So before I get into this, Miss Olivia, how you doing?
This is great. Okay, so Ed Kaufman said, right before Sirhan got involved with New Age books, he had serious head injuries from trying to be a jockey. Mm-hmm. Would those head injuries make him easier to hypnotize?
Isn't that interesting? Quite possibly. And we've seen actually a lot of psychics like Peter Hurkos or even Edgar Casey had head injuries before they became super psychics. So there's no doubt that there could be an association there. Yes.
He also added that Sirhan got his first job working with horses at a ranch owned by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball.
It's true. And
wow.
What's interesting about that is he worked at a racetrack, and there was someone there who worked with him. And this is probably, now, if you really look for how Bryan got into his life, Thomas Bremer worked at that horse track as well. Thomas Bremer's brother, Arthur, is the person who assassinated or shot Governor George Wallace in the 1972 election when Wallace was running as independent against Nixon. So he had done this. Wallace was, as a racist candidate, was one of the most successful independent candidates in 1968, which really shows you the fracture going on in 68. And when he's going to run in 72, somebody's looking at him and thinking there's a possibility he'll split the vote or whatever, and he gets shot. The person who takes him out is Arthur Bremer, and Thomas Bremer, his brother, worked at this strange racetrack with Sirhan. It's quite remarkable because Bremer has all the earmarks of being mind-controlled as well. Yes.
I just want to say, we're going to have to follow up on this, but, David Donaway is reminding us that, Desi and Lucy, or Desilu, who produced Star Trek.
Yes.
And Star Trek is related to that group that what is that?
The
group?
9.
The 9.
Yeah.
Right. So there might be something there for all we know.
No question. Whenever you get around, whenever you get around this political center and when deep state actions are taking place, there's always an aerospace, a phantom aerospace and a real aerospace aspect that come up. When you look at Ruth Paine, for example, who housed the Oswalds, her mother, being one of the biggest Forbes, she had this incredible circle there, and that was the foundation of the original 9. And out of that group, people like Uri Geller and all the rest come out of that. So the fundamental thing of the 9 and how strange and bizarre that all becomes is that they think that they're communicating with like Egyptian gods on a spaceship. This is how intense this is. And they meet on a regular basis to do this.
Right, they're dedicated.
Yes, absolutely. And they do it over all these years. And what's fascinating is, Ruth Paine in that world, it's Bell, from the man who starts Bell Helicopter. He is the one who's right in the center of that group. And Bell Helicopter becomes where Ruth Paine's husband works. And it's his, Michael Paine is his name, his stepdad, who is married, he now is in this whole milieu. And it's because he's part of the 9. He's into that. He's deeply, deeply mystical all the way through. And it is Michael Paine, who is working at Bell Helicopter and who is his immediate superior. It's Walter Dornberger, and Dornberger is, he's this paperclip Nazi who starts the X technology program. So we're deep, deep into those associations. I mean, it's so off the charts when you get into it. There's that mystical aspect. And you can see even with the Sirhan case, as we touch into it, I'm going to show a really huge, huge aerospace connection. But right off the bat, what I want to say is that the mystical side, the mystery schools, Theosophy, Manly P. Hall, they're all there, right in the middle of this, which is quite remarkable, just sitting there. And we're stuck with a story for 50 years of this guy who was a disgruntled Palestinian who was upset about Kennedy's policies that he didn't even know about, as it turns out. So what's the real story? So you can see how it's a different type of programming that we've got. Yes.
Well, I mean, it just goes back to Nazis in Vril, right? I mean, this is,
Yes.
You've got the technology and you've got
Yes.
the supernatural, the paranormal.
No question about it.
It's fascinating.
I did raise the specter of giving us this newsman's account of what he witnessed. So let's get to that real quickly. Here he is. And this is what he observed in going back to the story about Thane Eugene Cesar. So here he is telling his story that night for WATV, which is a local news station. He was there. He was in the pantry. He witnessed the whole thing. This is what he saw.
The entryway following the senator. He stopped, shook hands with several people, and started to progress again. We were packed in there like sardines. There were lights and cameras and people and a lot of excitement. The senator just finished shaking hands with someone, and another man, I think it was the maitre d', walked up and took his hand. As we were slowly pushed forward, another man stepped out, and he shot. Just then the guard who was standing behind Kennedy took out his gun, and he fired also. The next thing I knew is that Kennedy was shot 3 times.
Now, how far was Sirhan from Senator Kennedy at the time?
So what he saw Thane Eugene Cesar pull out his gun and fire. This is why his testimony is so crucial. They scrapped his testimony, and the segment at WATV where they played this, they took it out of their records. Wow. Somebody had a copy of that. It's the only reason that we still have that. They didn't have videotaping in those days, but somebody in the station had a copy. So they got rid of it. They expunged it because they didn't want on record that Thane Eugene Cesar was seen firing his weapon. it was a crucial piece to leave out. Now we're going to bring around Thane Eugene Cesar and why he was there, who put him there, and how it turned out that he was being put into position to do the actual assassination, and Sirhan is just set up as the patsy for this. And who had done that? I want to start with, this is a book that goes back from, it's Peter Dale Scott is editing all of these other writers, and it's called The Assassinations. And this is actually a 1970s book, but it's loaded with crucial information done right at the period. And I'm going to give us this little snapshot of ex-steganography when we get into this. They're trying to figure out, are there cases in history where somebody was on record in a court case, mind control to do assassination? And something very interesting comes up. So he says, a good investigator looks into every possibility, no matter how fantastic. And Sirhan had played around with mind-bending exercises. And this is true. He had done all kinds of self-hypnosis type activity. But where had he learned it? It wasn't just in books. I thought the line was worth pursuing, and so, marvel of marvels, did Sirhan. He finally asked me on December 31st to investigate further. Could anyone have had such an influence over his mind? Sirhan asked him to do it, this investigator. And this whole, I'll get into who this chapter is by. But what's remarkable is, he says, I did some research on crime and hypnosis and discovered interesting real-life examples of murder by proxy through hypnosis. In 1951 in Copenhagen, Bjorn Nielsen had programmed Paley Hadrup to go into trance at the sight of the letter X, rob a bank, and kill anyone who got in his way, almost completely unaware that he'd been used. Unlike the fictional Raymond Shaw from The Manchurian Candidate, Hadrup had some notion of what had happened. In jail, he recalled enough about his former associations with Nielsen to suspect that he had been used. And he moved to confide his suspicion to a psychiatrist who, as I reported earlier, spent almost a year cracking the locking mechanism that obscured Hadrup's recollection. This is quite fascinating because it is this locking mechanism which is still in place in Sirhan. And a new investigation, you could literally work with him with a couple of expert hypnosis, brainwashing experts, and crack that code. Now, on February 8th, 1969, during the trial, Sirhan's psychiatrist, Dr. Diamond, programmed Sirhan under hypnosis to climb the bars of his cell. Sirhan had no idea what he was doing up on the top of the bars when he finally discovered that climbing was not his own idea, but Dr. Diamond's. He was struck with the plausibility of the idea that perhaps he had been programmed by someone else in a like manner to kill Robert Kennedy. This is the crucial aspect, which is he had been demonstrated to have this ability, and other psychiatrists could manipulate him in such a fashion. And then when he wakes up and he finds himself on top of the bars, he starts to think, maybe I was programmed. It's always strange in the case of Sirhan that, that he says, I don't remember shooting Kennedy. How does that happen? How do you go in there, as a zealot, supposedly trying to kill the senator, and you can't remember what you did? It would seem unlikely, let's say. All right, now, this is a crucial piece. It's been left off the table, and it is H.L. Hunt's lawyer. H.L. Hunt's lawyer has shown up recently trying to get his story out. He has waited for years. And
it's amazing he's still alive.
He cites I know, he's an older Texan, and he cites the fact that RFK Jr. came out and made this comment about Thane Eugene Cesar as one of his inspirations. I should say about H.L. Hunt that he was the richest man in the world during the 1960s and into the 70s, and he left a large family fortune, and he is the character that they modeled JR on. from the Dallas series. What's fascinating too is that if you watch the movie Nixon, Larry Hagman plays Hunt.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, meeting Nixon, and it's interesting because he actually JR was modeled on Hunt. What eventually happens is that Nelson and Bunker Hunt spend a lot of his money on the silver market, and they mess up, and so the Hunts kind of went down there. They're still a powerful influence in oil, but not as big as when he was around. So in any case, he has this loyal, John Curington is a loyal lawyer who does all these tasks for him, sometimes stuff that's kind of shady, quite frankly. But, given the nature that you're working for the richest man in the world, I guess that's part of the territory. In the late spring, now this is from his book directly. The book is called H.L. Hunt, Motive and Opportunity. This is a book that came out last year and was completely overlooked, probably because at the end of the day, Curington wasn't looking to do a big promotional campaign. He was looking to get his information out, and he did. And there it is for anyone. So here we are reading it. So he talks about oddities involving the JFK assassination. We're not going to get into those. Those have been explored, interestingly enough, by other researchers on the JFK case with Hunt. It's well known that Hunt is part of this milieu of oil men who wanted to remove President Kennedy. And what's interesting is that Peter Dale Scott has pointed out that Hunt had his own intelligence network outside of the Central Intelligence Agency, and later learned that this intelligence network was the Gehlen German intelligence network. So it is what we modeled the CIA on. So we're looking at that very strange interface again with this post-Nazi element. But let's keep going. In the late spring of 1968, Mr. Hunt came in and told me that he wanted me to go to Los Angeles the next day. Now, late spring in this case is literally 2 weeks before the assassination. I was to get tickets, and this is the Kennedy assassination, RFK. I was to get tickets for both of us, along with a room at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Now, this is the richest man in the world who usually stays in Beverly Hills. This time he's saying, I want a room, and I want it to be at the Ambassador, which is not really on the billionaire level. I was to get tickets for both of us, along with a room at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Even though we had never stayed at the Ambassador before, our usual accommodations were at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The trip itself wasn't an unusual request. However, because we went to California every month or so, I made the arrangements, and when we arrived, Mr. Hunt told me two things. First, he asked me to contact Wendell Niles. This was a man whose father was Bob Hope's TV announcer. So Wendell was very well connected in LA. We had him on the payroll so that he would keep us advised as to what was going on in the movie industry and in the Los Angeles area. Mr. Hunt wanted me to find out from Niles exactly what Bobby Kennedy had been doing in California, including where he'd been, where he was going, and who was in his inner circle. I left Wendell a message to call me at the hotel. We arrived at the Ambassador Hotel, and Mr. Hunt told me that he was just going to have a private meeting with a fellow, and for me to just go to my room and wait to hear from Wendell. It was clear that whatever the business might be, I wasn't going to be privy to it. This was a little unusual. I contacted Wendell Niles while Mr. Hunt had dinner with the mystery person, and afterward never commented on it. I don't know who it was or what they discussed. When I saw Mr. Hunt later, I gave him the information that Wendell Niles had provided. We left to return to Dallas the next day, with nothing ever being said about the business in LA. Mr. Hunt never even hinted as to why we made the trip. Within 2 weeks, Robert F. Kennedy would be dead. Now there is a follow-up on this. On the assassination day, June 5th, 1968, Kennedy had recently won the California primary election, and on that night, he had just finished addressing his campaign supporters in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. It was just after midnight. His only security was a former FBI agent and two professional athletes. One of these guys was Rosie Greer. Kennedy was planning on simply walking through the ballroom on his way to a gathering elsewhere in the hotel. but campaign aide Fred Dutton diverted him through the hotel's kitchen for a quick impromptu press conference. As he followed the hotel maitre d' through a narrow kitchen hallway, he reached out to shake a busboy's hand, and Sirhan Sirhan moved over to him and repeatedly fired a .22 caliber Ivor Johnson cadet revolver. Robert F. Kennedy was rushed to the Central Receiving Hospital, where doctors performed heart massage and stabilized his heartbeat. He was then transferred a few blocks away to the Hospital of the Good Samaritan for surgery to have the bullets removed and wounds treated. In spite of the extensive neurosurgery, he died at 1:44 a.m., 26 hours after the shooting. Kennedy had been hit 3 times, and he goes through all this. I personally found out about the shooting about 5 minutes after it happened. My phone rang, and it was Wendell Niles from L.A. with the news. I hung up and immediately called Mr. Hunt, who didn't express any interest one way or the other. He said something like, "Okay, we'll talk about that tomorrow," and that was the extent of it. Unlike the killing of John F. Kennedy, where Oswald's role of assassin had been repeatedly challenged, the murder of Bobby Kennedy was up close and personal in a room full of many witnesses. Okay, so he goes into that there. But here's the weird part. And he mentions the programming aspect, and he talks about the Manchurian Candidate, and so on. As this book was being finalized, 2 very interesting things happened. First of all, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. went public with the story that he examined the autopsy of his father and even met with Sirhan Sirhan and just did not believe that he fired the fatal shot. RFK Jr. is now calling for a new investigation into the death of his father. At about the same time, someone else made a similar demand. Paul Schrade, the union official and friend to Robert Kennedy. Mr. Schrade was walking through the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel, and he was shot himself in the head. Okay, here's where the story goes into something he can put on the record that will help RFK Jr.'s case. Approximately 4 to 6 weeks after the assassination, Mr. Hunt called me in and told me he needed to send $40,000 to California to a fellow, but he didn't want me to take it. Instead, he wanted me to pick somebody in the organization that I trusted, but who wouldn't be readily connectable to the Hunt company. That was a lot of money. Keep in mind that in today's world, that would be almost about $300,000. I selected a man named Mark Deering, who was in a different building from ours. He came over to First National Bank building, and Mr. Hunt personally gave him 2 envelopes with the money. Each had $20,000. Mr. Hunt didn't give him any instructions. He just gave him the cash. I told Mark that a man named Tom would meet him at the airport, and he would give him the money. Tom. Keep that name in mind. Remember that at the time, no one searched bags before the flight, not even a carry-on. So it was a trivial task to take 2 envelopes full of money onto a plane. When Mark landed in LA, another man, not Tom, was at the airport to collect the money. Since it wasn't the fellow we were expecting, Mark phoned me for further instruction. I informed him we weren't going to release the money to anyone but Tom. Mark relayed this to the man, who called his boss to explain the situation. The fellow who was supposed to be the recipient of the money, Tom, finally spoke to Mark and told him that they would meet at the Ambassador Hotel for the handoff, which they did. It's curious that they met at the location where Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Mark returned to Dallas and told me that he had delivered the money as ordered. He turned in a handwritten report, and that was the last thing I ever heard about it. I have no idea what the money was for or why it had to be delivered by someone who wasn't that identifiable with the Hunt organization. I still have his report, and he shows a picture of the report there. And then he says, final thoughts on RFK. The strangest thing about our California trip was that I'd been left out of whatever business meeting that Mr. Hunt had. I delivered large sums of money to pay off his gambling debts in the past and also collected from the people that owed him. I'd been part of every aspect of his business, so I cannot imagine what transpired that night for the life of me. And then there's the payment that had to be delivered after RFK was killed, along with the fact that it had to be delivered by someone besides me. On most every other occasion, I was the only one that Mr. Hunt would trust with a cachet of money like that. All of these facts are ingredients, interesting, and although at the time I knew better than to ever ponder what had gone on, at this point in my life, I have to look back with more than a little curiosity and a few questions, and here they are. Why did we make a sudden trip to Los Angeles 2 weeks before the assassination? Why did we stay at the Ambassador Hotel, a place that we had never used before? Why did Mr. Hunt meet his business associate alone? Usually he took this guy with him. Why was Wendell Niles instructed to give daily reports regarding Robert Kennedy's actions? Why did H.L. Hunt show no interest when I told him within a few minutes of Robert Kennedy's shooting? Why did the $40,000 payoff end up at the Ambassador Hotel? I don't have the answers to these questions, but they're very interesting. I do know for a fact that Mr. Hunt believed that Bobby Kennedy would get the '68 Democratic nomination and that after he would be elected President of the United States, something that was almost unthinkable to H.L. Hunt. That is the testimony of John Carrington, who was H.L. Hunt's lawyer for decades. He's finally on the record. But again, in the crossfire of information flowing around in independent media circles or mainstream circles, this guy's testimony is completely missed. This is the fascinating thing. The information is there. We have the information. He's saying that H.L. Hunt had gone to the Ambassador Hotel 2 weeks before the assassination, and he's saying that he had private meetings that excluded him and that he made private payoffs and that he was tracking Bobby Kennedy. That's, I think, absolutely breakthrough.
Well, it makes sense, right? Because Hunt was involved in JFK's assassination and everybody was afraid. That's really the reason for killing RFK.
Yes.
Right? Is that he was going to reopen the JFK assassination case and bring people to justice. Right?
Yeah, and gain control over that whole wing of aerospace, along with every other aspect of the power of this country. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 90. We are opening up the vista deep, deep into the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. And now we've found a major piece from the lawyer of H.L. Hunt. Yes.
So why Bob Hope? Did you get to that?
Listen, I'm going to tell you very strangely, if you get around the kind of Kathy O'Brien style literature, Bob Hope shows up a lot.
Oh, that's right.
Bob Hope is really close to all the presidents. And,
see, this is why there's value in going back over history, because all of these players, it's just the next generation, but that apparatus is still in place.
Yes.
So you've got the pedophiles in Hollywood.
Yes.
Right? And you've got the mystery schools, MKUltra. You've got the aerospace, big time aerospace
No question.
wing. So yeah, we're still dealing with all these people.
It's remarkable. It is truly remarkable. And well, when we look at it now, and we're going to get into your questions here, you can ask them all in caps, and Miss Olivia will take them. And I know we've had a big presentation here. We're going to try to get as many questions
So
as
are you
possible.
going to go more into Mayhew?
Yes, that's
Okay.
the next thing that we're going
Alrighty.
into, right? Now, here's the crucial piece in all of this, and why my conversations around John Meyer and John Meyer coming forward and us arranging, to work with John Meyer's testimony. And I'll say more about that as time goes on, but it's in the works. John Meyer had been, just like this guy, had been Hunt's lawyer for decades. John Meyer had been Howard Hughes' bookkeeper for decades, and he had to interact with that whole crew, including Robert Mayhew. Now, Robert Mayhew also was working closely and Hughes was working closely with Don Nixon, who is Richard Nixon's brother. And what had happened was his brother had gotten this incredible loan from Hughes of something like $500,000 back then. or more like 300,000. And he had opened up a series of fast food restaurants. This was the power of Hughes. And in exchange, Hughes was really infuriated that Hughes Aerospace was being taxed at such a level, because he wanted to do all these things. He wanted to be first in space, and he felt like he was being held back, even though he was right up there as the richest man in the world himself. And what happened was he made a deal, and Richard Nixon arranged it so that Hughes Aerospace could become Hughes Medical, and that they could run it completely as a charity, completely non-taxable.
Who does that remind me of?
Think about that. Now, when we look at these situations, these characters, these people, now we're really deep into understanding some of those early connections. This is how Hughes Aircraft became a major player on the X technology and bringing this forward. All this technology comes up and then basically disappears right around Apollo. And then we go to the moon for the last time in 1972. That's the last manned mission. Then, we have little things like shuttles and stuff, but no manned missions to any of the planets or the moon. Nothing. Suddenly, out of the blue, Space Force. They start talking about this again. This is very important. Let's go back to Hughes for a moment. Hughes' bookkeeper, who, by the way, was chased all over the globe and had assassination attempts against him. And it was somebody who wanted to be friends with the Kennedys. He'd had a meeting with RFK before RFK was assassinated. And RFK said, I know what you're doing with Hughes Medical. I know he got that tax-free thing. I'm going to investigate Hughes. Hughes and Kennedy were huge enemies. Meyer tried to play himself between all these factions. He was kind of like, the diplomat in the middle. And there are pictures of him with Ted Kennedy, and he had become an ambassador. He had all these different types of political experiences. But anyway, from his own diary, I'm going to read a few entries, and we're going to see one piece open up that's dramatically links all these players. And then we're going to complete the picture with the aerospace connection. Here we go. This is from a June 13th entry and into his diary. And I guess I should start with the June 5th entry, because what happens here, June 4th, Tuesday, Bob Mayhew asked if certain Hughes key people could be at a staff meeting he was holding at 10 a.m. Since he left as the person running Hughes Nevada operations, he would be responsible for Hughes offices at the Frontier Hotel. He felt that all communications to and from Hughes' suite should go through him. He said he had informed Hughes companies, Hughes Aircraft, and Hughes private offices that this was to be done for security reasons. 2 p.m. I had a message to call Robert Kennedy at John Frankenheimer's beach house in Malibu. I called, and Bob said he and his wife and children were resting and swimming. I told him I would come to LA on Wednesday and bring everything pertaining to the AEC with me. 4:30 p.m. Don Nixon left a message to call him, and I called him at 732-8847. And he said he had spoken with his brother Richard and that he, Don, would come on June 5th, but he was not about to pay for his plane trip or hotel. I told him I was going to LA on June 5th, and I would try to get on the same flight with him to Vegas. Now think about it. Meyer's going to be in LA on the same day of the assassination. Just so happens. I was booked on Western Flight 64, leaving at 3:45, arriving in Vegas at 4:30 p.m. I then called Mayhew, and his response was that the next time all you people should listen to me. June 5th, I got up at 4 a.m., went to shower and shave, put on the morning news about the primary. The newscaster was talking about the sadness of the shooting of Kennedy, and I assumed he was talking about the JFK assassination in relation to the Robert F. Kennedy primary results. He then said that Robert Kennedy was shot at 12:15 a.m. I was so totally shocked at this news that I cut myself while shaving. I began frantically trying to reach either Paul Schrade or Harry Evans on the telephone when the newscaster reported that Evans and Schrade had also been shot. He listed some others as well. This is right out of his diary. 2:30 p.m. I reached Harry Evans at the Kaiser Hotel. He gives the number, where Paul Schrade was taken after the shooting at the Ambassador Hotel. Evans said he was trailing a bit behind Schrade and was entering a doorway into the ambassador's serving pantry when gunfire broke out. Because of the crush of people, he was unable to get much closer. Evans said an enormous number of shots were fired and that Schrade took a bullet in the head. Evans said Frank Mankiewicz, RFK's press secretary, had called and said, "The senator is still alive, but it does not look promising for him." Evans said that Elizabeth Evans, who was hit by a ricochet bullet, was no relation to him. 5 p.m., Don Nixon called the Vegas airport and demanded to know where I was and why nobody was there to pick him up. When I explained the reason, he became even more agitated and said words to the effect of, "Who cares? What about my hotel room?" Nixon's brother. His concern over Kennedy was non-existent and placed well behind who was going to pay for his taxi in the room. He checked into the Frontier Hotel and made several calls to me, which I did not return. I went to bed totally exhausted, shocked, and sick about the events of the day. At 5 a.m., June 6th, Bob Mayhew called to ask about the Don Nixon meeting and suggested 8:30 for breakfast. I went to the club. Mayhew was all smiles, and Don Nixon was all smiles. What followed next had to be seen to be believed. They embraced each other, and Don Nixon said, "Well, quote, that prick is dead."
Whoa.
Pardon my language, unquote. And Mayhew said, "Well, it looks like your brother is in now," meaning Nixon. At the time, I did not even know what they were talking about. Mayhew joked that they should now be calling Don Nixon Mr. Vice President. I still did not realize that Robert Kennedy had died, and when they saw I was unaware, Mayhew told me, "John, you're out of it. Why don't you go home and Don and I will carry on without you?" The thing I recall was Don worrying about who was going to take him to the airport to catch the Western 1:05 p.m. flight to LA. Mayhew said he would take him personally, as they had so much to talk about. So he does some calls to the Kennedy family moving down, and he makes some calls. June 7th, he arrives at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York after taking the subway from Astoria. Security was extremely heavy after the church where Robert Kennedy was laying in state. The security guard refused me admission until I mentioned a family friend's name. So he goes on and he talks about this, and he gets to a very crucial piece. Monday, June 10th. Went to my office at the Frontier Hotel and tried to organize my files and catch up on a few hectic days. Received a message to call Bob Mayhew, and when we talked, he advised me not to discuss the meeting with Don Nixon or anything pertaining to Robert Kennedy. Now, Harry Evans called to complain that the Frontier phone system was not working. In passing, Evans said that his call had somehow been transferred to Mayhew's office, and when Mayhew got on the line, he was rude. I told him not to give it another thought, that Mayhew was tired from the stress of moving our offices. Now, what happens in here is that Don Nixon starts to brag about how Robert Mayhew set up the entire assassination of Kennedy. And Mayhew, hearing that, comes and pays a visit to basically make sure that anyone who's heard that doesn't pursue it. But there's a crucial piece in here about an observation on behalf of Meyer, which spins the whole case on his head. So listen closely as we get in deep here. June 13th, 1968, 7 a.m., I called Milt Pollan to wish him happy birthday, and he told me he'd spoken with Mayor Yorty. You remember, the one whose Manly P. Hall was his guru? He told him something strange pertaining to the Kennedy assassination, and that the police chief of L.A., Redden, had said that RFK had refused to have a security guard from the police department that was offered to him. The fact is that no security was ever offered by the LAPD. So this story was a total fake. I had breakfast at the Frontier Hotel at 8 a.m. with Frank DeLuzio to discuss the AEC underground testing program. Hughes was obsessed with atomic testing, and he felt that the atomic testing was going to ruin everything he had in Las Vegas. So he wanted to get them to stop these tests in Las Vegas. Harry Evans called at 2 p.m., and I relayed the offer to let Schrade use Hughes' Spring Mountain Ranch. Evans was elated and said that he would make arrangements for Schrade to talk with me on the phone. Apparently, there was no phone in Schrade's hospital room. I called Schrade at 3 p.m. and we spoke for at least an hour. He described what happened at the Ambassador Hotel early in the morning of June 5th. Schrade said he believed a live electrical wire from a TV camera had made contact with the wet concrete floor. He didn't realize he'd been shot until a doctor told him in Kaiser Hospital. This is a weird thing because Schrade, when he gets shot, thinks he's being electrocuted. 7 p.m. Listen closely. Listening to the radio where they were discussing the RFK assassination and who was shot, they mentioned Thane Cesar, who was a security guard at the hotel working for Ace Guard Security. He was also employed by Lockheed Aircraft. I remember Thane from his trips to Vegas, where he was meeting with numerous gaming people and was introduced to me by Jack Hopper, who's an associate of Robert Mayhew. Thane Eugene Cesar, who is supposedly on the record a known security guard, just a nobody, hired 3 days earlier. When his name comes up, reading a general report about who was there, instantly Meyer, who is Hughes' bookkeeper for decades, his close confidant, recognizes him. He knew him. Thane had come and hung out in Las Vegas and was an associate of Mayhew. Mayhew used Thane Eugene Cesar as the assassin that night in the ballroom. And that's why when Meyer talks about Nixon saying that Mayhew set up the assassination, now we have Meyer on the record saying he knew Thane and that Thane was an associate. So now the assassin in the room, the person who had the gun, we try to find out what the reason would be. Well, the hit was on. Mayhew was hugging Don Nixon's brother and saying, "You're going to be the president's, the president, your brother's going to be president." And Mayhew sets up the assassination of Kennedy to guarantee that. Mayhew is a Hughes operator, but he's a CIA interface point. All the pieces connect there. But then every time we look at these assassins, there's always the aerospace connection. We've got the Lockheed connection with Thane Eugene Cesar. But now I'm going to give you basically the main piece on Thane. But how's it going out there, Miss Olivia?
Good. I've got a great little tidbit.
Yes.
So this is so wild. Sigurd said Robert Vaughn, the actor, said in his bio, his memoir probably, Onassis was responsible for the RFK assassination. I've never heard that, but I hadn't thought of Robert Vaughn, and we just watched Bullet the other night, and Robert Vaughn was in it.
Isn't that fascinating?
One of the many synchronicities this week.
Yeah, well, there's a whole piece on Onassis and the assassination that comes out of the Gemstone file. As far as I'm concerned, when we're looking at the JFK assassination, Onassis is around, but it's always been a tough piece because of what's happened with Onassis and Jackie, that there's so many things to explore with Onassis, but it's been a tough sell for me on the side of whether he was involved in the assassination. But it's so interesting.
He has his incentive.
Yes.
We know that he was in love with Jackie for years.
That's not the kind of thing, you don't assassinate a president over that.
Probably not.
But I definitely, there's so many overlapping things, including the fact that Onassis had such, his connections go all the way back to Nazi South America. So he's an incredible smuggler, and he's a main person in terms of changing policy. What's interesting is Joseph Farrell came forward and said that he was a minder. So that is very, very interesting. That makes a lot more sense to me. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 90. We're going deep, deep into the RFK assassination. And now we've found the fingerprints directly of Mayhew and Howard Hughes in the Ambassador Hotel. At Lockheed Aircraft, where did Thane Eugene Cesar, what aspect of that, where was he? And I'm going to give you that right now. And this is going to connect him directly with the Aerospace Division. All right. Remember this fellow. Ben Rich. Ben Rich was the director of Skunk Works. He was behind all of the advanced tech projects that they kept safe over there. Highly rumored, and all the X-Tech UFO redevelopment work. That's Ben Rich from Lockheed Skunk Works. His famous quote, said to many of his people, is here. Lockheed Skunk Works director says, "We can take ET home." Ben Rich, quote, "We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects. And it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do. We now have the technology to take ET home. No, it won't take someone's lifetime to do it. There was an error in those equations. We know what it is. We now have the capability to travel to the stars." That Ben Rich, that Skunk Works, that's where Eugene Thane Cesar worked. And he was recruited by Robert Mayhew out of that milieu. And he worked directly for a security company. And that security company was owned, it was Bel Air Security. That security company was owned by Robert Mayhew. So the links there are complete with that. And with Miss Olivia, now it's up to you.
Okay, handsome stranger. Is Hughes now called Raytheon? As the Hughes factory where I live is now Raytheon.
Well, yeah, Hughes Aircraft got sold and a number of divisions spawned out of it. In the 90s, it was still active. And so it's become a part of several different aerospace companies. So it is quite interesting that the assets got set up to such a point. Hughes Aircraft really became a major piece of the secret space program. So what we've learned is that Thane Eugene Cesar, first we had the information that Thane Eugene Cesar was the assassin, that he had a gun out, and that the trajectories matched more from him than from Sirhan, according to Noguchi and all the rest. Then we have eyewitness testimony saying that he took his gun out, and some eyewitness testimony saying that he fired. Then we have the fact that he was directly behind Kennedy. We have the fact that he was a CIA asset, that he worked for Mayhew, who co-ran the Hughes empire, and that Mayhew bragged about, that Don Nixon bragged about Mayhew taking care of the assassination. So, and then that aerospace piece, which we connect with the X-Tech around all of these deep state assassinations, again, now we have it, Thane Eugene Cesar in Skunk Works. And Skunk Works being where Ben Rich had redeveloped this incredible technology, talking about sending ET home again. That's the UFO file. It's all right there in the heart of it. And then we have programmed Sirhan, and we have his programmer bragging about it. So this is where the case is breaking incredibly wide open in terms of our perspective on it. So go for it.
Okay, so Ed Kaufman wanted to remind us that Howard Hughes bought a home in the the Las Vegas area from the widow of the Alfred Krupp of Krupp Industries in Nazi Germany.
Oh, yes.
Yes. You'd have to research for months to really open this up about these connections between the American industrialists and the Nazis, which I'm sure are there, but to really connect them all.
No question about it. I mean, Hughes is a special case, again, because he had access to advanced technology. And it's funny, as soon as JFK was assassinated, RFK's first thought is, we should have investigated Hughes. And he's probably thinking that directly because of Mayhew. I'm going to get right down to it. Yes, keep rolling.
Okay, Solid Snake. Did Hughes Medical participate in researching or fund MKUltra programs?
Well, it's interesting. They said that Hughes Medical was largely used as a front for advanced technology. However, apparently the CIA used the Hughes money as a slush fund. It was a kind of a black budget slush fund. And considering all the people on the CIA side who were associated with Hughes, probably the secrecy of a lot of those experiments would be safely done in association with Hughes facilities. Go for it.
Okay, I don't know this person. So Ed Kaufman again. Did Mayhew have a direct connection with Yvel Younger? And if so, what would be the nature of that relationship?
Mayhew and
Yvel Younger?
Yeah, well, it's probably not so pertinent to this conversation.
Okay, all right.
But interesting.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you, what do you know? Christian wants to know what you know about Hedy Lamarr as Hughes' personal somnambulist. Now, I've heard about this before.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hughes had Peter Hurkos come in from behind a blind, and Hurkos would give him psychic diagnosis. He would give him psychic interpretations of all kinds of things. So this is very interesting because I had a thing when looking at Hurkos' career, and it's very unusual, which is that Hurkos shows up in Mexico during these deep, when people are looking deeply for Atlantean ruins. And so Hurkos has the CIA deep state aspect, just like Uri Geller does. The fact that Hurkos was basically the personal psychic for Hughes gives us some idea of where Hughes' head was at. No question about it. Yes.
Okay, so David Donaway is talking about Serco. I don't know what Serco is, but other people were discussing Serco in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very interesting. And
so Serco Inc. has received a new $57 million contract from the U.S. Space Force to manage, operate, and maintain the ground-based electro-optical deep space surveillance system. Just
very
putting that out
interesting.
there.
Yes. Well, it's interesting to see how aerospace has grown up. One of the things that we brought forward about Lytton is just how deep they were in this aerospace wing. This phase of Hughes Aerospace, Lytton, and Lockheed and Boeing, that period there from the late 50s, the development all the way into the 80s, is a crucial step period. Now they're going into large-scale consolidation. And what's fascinating is it took this secret space program to set up and privatize all this apparatus so that you basically, things like SpaceX and all the rest of it aren't really accountable the way NASA is. And, space mining, space tourism, and space observation, they can all be privatized, which means the public really never can get a glimpse of what they're doing.
Okay, so I love the ideas room because everybody has all the answers.
Yes.
Okay, so Lady Zaga says Serco manages all the prisons in the U.S. Okay, and Lee Beltman says SES, Serco, Five Eyes, and Dynacore are well known in the security world. So that's who we're dealing with there.
Yes, very interesting indeed.
Mhm.
So basically, yeah, one of the things we can do when we're looking at the setup for these different aerospace companies is we can see who the leaders are. And we can see that some of these companies that were very close around the UFO file, like Bigelow, for example, they had defenders in government, like Harry Reid was really big into giving those contracts. And the whole thing that came out about ATIP and all that, which is real minor league stuff. But that all went directly to Bigelow and Bigelow Aerospace. And he has an open, he openly talks about his belief in UFOs and all the rest of it. So, we're looking there, we can see how this whole program graduated up from where it was in those very highly secretive periods into these other periods where you have guys at the head of these space companies who are open UFO advocates. Yeah.
Just to follow up, David Dunaway said, Serco is helping run the contact tracing in the US and the UK and runs US patents, much of US defense systems, and atomic plants, backed by Rothschild.
Oh, well, the atomic part definitely makes sense. I did not know they were doing the contact tracing, and that's the whole next wave of this. Okay.
Okay.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're on X-90 here, and we're going to be taking a few more of your questions. But we want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, which keeps us in touch with each other, and also make sure that we have that connection going on one-on-one, because we've seen so many people get thrown off social media. So to have that direct pipeline is so crucial. So just take that extra minute to go to darkjournalist.com and make sure that you're in there on the newsletter. And we have some incredible guests coming up for you for June. Yes.
Dash Rendar. Sirhan was stabbed in a prison riot that involved 80 people in August 2019. Do you think it was a deep state attempt on Sirhan? Large riots usually involve prison gang coordination.
Well, it's interesting timing, isn't it? Considering Kennedy was talking directly with Thane Eugene Cesar's associates to set up this meeting. And then in September, right after that, Sirhan gets knifed. Then he dies. Thane Eugene Cesar was pretty old. He was in his 80s. So, but the timing there is just extraordinary. I always felt that the timing of those two events was certainly unusual. Okay,
so JJK says, I'm not from the USA. Does the Philippines have a non-extradition law with the USA?
Well, they're pretty tight, but I think it makes things a lot looser. One of the things that I should have mentioned is that Ben Rich, who ran Lockheed Skunk Works, was born in Manila. So he was from the Philippines, which means there may be a whole network operative of this aerospace side. And when they get these people who they have out and they do these things, their reward might be, you'll live fine, but you have to get the hell out of here because we can't ever have you coming up for trial. And certainly in the case of Thane Eugene Cesar, it gets very murky because Cesar was only 26 at the time of the assassination. How did he rise in the ranks so fast with Hughes and Mayhew and the CIA to be trusted with such a mission? And, how did he, there are indications that there was a whole coordination there in the pantry, and it wasn't just him operating. Obviously, they had the patsy set up to shoot and distract everybody, and then Thane could get behind him and shoot him. But there's a whole coordination to the fact that he's hired on 3 days earlier and that the cops don't want his gun and all the rest of it. So it's quite remarkable, and you have to look at somebody like Thane Eugene Cesar and say, he must have been so well trusted by Mayhew to pull this off. But there are all the players right there in the Ambassador. 26, though, it's quite remarkable. Yes.
Okay, also JJK. So Cesar never admitted to it. He never confessed to the killing.
No. He gave many unusual answers about what kind of guns he had and what he did with the guns. He claimed to have sold the gun at one point.
Did anybody hunt down the gun?
Yeah, I think what happened is because of the original bullets and all the rest of it were part of the LAPD, there was no way to get the gun and compare them. And the other thing was that the LAPD did not compare Sirhan's gun. This is kind of remarkable when you think about it. It's such a sham of a case on the legal side. It's remarkable that, it had the force, in a way, the operation of it had the force because everyone saw Sirhan shooting. Therefore, all they had to do was say, here was this guy shooting. And Noguchi is really the person, and the pushback against Noguchi is the crucial piece that says the establishment knew, some aspect of the establishment knew it was happening. Because when he says there's no way that a person 3 feet or 6 feet in front of him could have shot him and developed those wounds, they had to be close up directly, and the powder burns went into the tissue. So he said there was no way it could happen. Noguchi ran into enormous calls for his firing, this incredible pushback. And what happened was, though, he stood his ground and he got to retain his position. So, they got into a space where he really messed up there, as did many other researchers, everyone from Mae Brussel to some of the more modern ones. They've deconstructed the case and it has fallen apart, literally. I mean, a lot of the case has fallen apart directly on this program. Okay.
Ed Kaufman says Mae Brussel said that the man who was hired to kill Sirhan in prison was paid $25,000 from one of Nixon's plumbers.
To kill Sirhan in prison back then in the 70s. Yeah, remarkable. There's great research around that. William Turner's work. Lisa Pease has a major book on the Kennedy assassination, on the RFK assassination from 2018, which covers so much about the trial and the hotel. It's very complete. And I definitely think that some of the, in the milieu of the work of Peter Dale Scott, it's some of the best work around the assassinations. Yes.
Did they get to Howard Hughes at all? Those books?
No, I mean, Mayhew is certainly a considered factor, but the Hughes empire, but to the point where Hughes directly, I mean, one of the things that we've done here tonight, I want to point out, is that we've integrated the Mayhew story from John Meyer, which is that Don Nixon bragged that Mayhew took care of the entire assassination, and then Mayhew came to Meyer and said, I don't want you talking about any of this stuff. That's crucial. It comes directly out of his diary, and it's available in his book, Age of Secrets, which was banned in the United States. He's in Canada. So there's that major piece, which gives us an idea of who it was that was behind this. And then we have the other piece, which is H.L. Hunt's person. For all we know, the person he was delivering the money to, the intersection there, was someone associated directly with Thane Cesar, which is why they would have to go to the ambassador, which is where he worked. So we brought that all around with the aerospace aspect, and the aerospace aspect being that Skunk Works is a key. It's just unavoidable. If you look into the UFO file, and if you're ever looking for, the ET reference, and if you're looking for UFOs redeveloped, you come face to face over and over again with Skunk Works. They are notorious for having redeveloped UFOs and re-engineered the technology. And so when he says we can send ET back home now, he's giving us a big hint there that this is the advanced technology they've been working on. But here we have Thane Eugene Cesar, who's now being identified as the assassin, directly working for Skunk Works, not just for Lockheed Aircraft, but Skunk Works. So he's at that impenetrable level that James Garrison talked about in 1968 to the editor at Ramparts magazine when he said, I've found it. It's in the heart of the aerospace wing. But what does that tell us about the situation of the deep state and where we are now? Because there's been this gigantic situation of Clinton trying this UFO op through John Podesta and TTSA and all that, and then you have Trump coming in and taking it on as Space Force. So we're right in between those interfaces. Now we can understand where that meets up with the deep state. That's crucial, because if we don't understand the space part, the global control grid from space, the space fence, then I don't think we understand the deeper political elements that go on. Yes.
Aether, are there any reports of Sirhan Sirhan being visited by the Men in Black or officials from X-Protect?
That's pretty interesting. I think once they had him programmed to do what he did, he was an easy patsy, and people kind of forgot about him, and he could just be in prison. Even when they did the House Assassinations Committee, they didn't go after the RFK assassination, oddly enough. The JFK movie brought interest on the JFK files, but where was the RFK movie to do the same thing and move the story up front and center? RFK Jr. coming forward and saying this about Thane Eugene Cesar and saying that the investigation into his dad's murder, and remember his dad was once the top law enforcement officer in the country as Attorney General, for him to have received such a terrible police investigation by the LAPD, the case needs to be reopened. That has given us the kind of force and momentum that I think we might get some transparency on this. Yes.
Ed Kaufman, is it possible that the Nixon time capsule has details of all this aerospace secrecy stuff?
Yes, most definitely. Well, this is a story that fits right in with this, because Robert Merritt, who brought forward the whole idea of Nixon's secret message in the time capsule, he himself said they used him for assassination. So, as a member of the Houston plan. So there we have that interface again of these assassins around the UFO file and around the advanced aerospace wings of this. So it gets into a much more complex setup, I would say, than anything that we've considered beforehand. We've looked into a lot of cases at times on the UFO side, and we've looked into a lot of deep state assassinations or political intrigues. But the real interface of those two together provides a much fuller picture. And when you start to include elements like the mystery schools and how theosophy and hypnosis comes up in the Sirhan case, then I think we start getting a picture of it's that layer that's underneath. And the deep state aspect in combination with knowledge of the secret societies, this is where I think we get a much, it's explosive in terms of the consequences of that kind of dot connecting. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. This is episode 90. We've gone deep, deep, deep into Thane Eugene Cesar, working for Skunk Works and the advanced aerospace side, and who was in that room and how Senator Kennedy was assassinated, and putting H.L. Hunt's information on the record from his lawyer of many years. This is something where I think we now have enough information on the table to go forward and finally explode the media myth on this. It's just absolutely staggering information. We're going to take two more questions for tonight, and then we're going to wrap it up. And remember, I did suggest you go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for that newsletter. It's free, and it's something where you're going to get information on all the incredible shows we have coming up and some very special events as well as we get further into the summer. And I want to remind you, you can become a subscriber at darkjournalist.com, get behind the work that we're doing and really, kind of help us reach a different level of being able to do this type of investigation. And that is very incredible support.
Yeah, I can tell you this much. The books, there were a lot of book purchases this past week, and they got expensive because some of them are out of print.
I never, the job isn't, it's, sometimes it can get expensive. What's fascinating is how many different things are coming out and how we can connect those dots. Some of it hiding in plain sight, as Gigi Young would say with her series. There is material, and I want to say this in relation to people looking at things and trying to get ahead on advanced technology, X-Tech, the UFO file. They've been feeding you this nonsense about TTSA and running people over a cliff with nonsense. Those are CIA operations. They're all CIA people. The CIA was behind these deep state assassinations. The CIA, their clandestine covert wing, is completely extra constitutional. It has nothing to do with the United States constitutional government. So the last thing in the world we want is to, work with the CIA on the UFO file or advanced technology and take their information that they feed to the media, who is always running around as their poodle. That's exactly the wrong direction. Much better that we find the things that have been put on the record and get to that place of total realization about these things, explode the myths, and then these things become much more clear. The aerospace wing, that's really the unexplored wing. Even companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin now, they operate under an incredible cloud of secrecy. And that's something which needs a lot more transparency on our side. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, I'm going to link these two final questions.
Okay.
So Shelby Cobra says, is the CIA trolling the mystery schools for people they can use, people open to experiences? And Grandma Tippito says, is this like a forever battle between mystery schools and the CIA and the deep state interests? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, well, I agree with all of those. What's interesting, and it's a piece I didn't get around to tonight because there were so many good things to get to, but it has to do with the fact that Sirhan's lawyer was named Cooper, and his niece is Vicky Cooper. And Vicky Cooper started the most famous UFO magazine. So again, we have that direct interface. And there's a lot of information about her working directly with the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, Joseph Farrell went on the record talking about Jacques Vallée, and he did an excellent blog. And Jacques Vallée started talking about how all the abduction cases he felt were done by intelligence agencies as a kind of a psychological psyop. Now, my own personal reflection on classic alien abduction cases like Betty and Barney Hill and people of this nature is that they are what they appear to be. They're interfaces with something off-world. So I don't believe that myself, that all the cases are just this psyop thing. But I think that these groups have used our lack of knowledge about whatever that factor is to create their own versions of it. They used to call these MILABs, right, which is military abductions. This is a crucial piece. But I think the fact that Vicky Cooper is, again, his niece, Sirhan's lawyer's niece, and that then, this comes forward that she runs a UFO magazine and that she's involved on the CIA side, it does. They've had this infiltration before, and we've explored it on this show, which the CIA has thoroughly taken these issues and turned them into kind of a intel boon for themselves. And they've really spun the entire web of the story. And things like TTSA are just an extension of that now. Interestingly enough, William Cooper, who a lot of people have a lot of respect for because of his book, Behold a Pale Horse, and that was a 90s book, he actually pointed out this connection of Vicky Cooper. And he talks about Don Ecker, who's still somebody you see in this milieu. And he says, and I quote, "The most damning evidence for the control of UFO magazine and Vicky Cooper comes from Don Ecker. At the 1989 MUFON conference, Don Ecker became so uninhibited that he managed to relate the following story to me and to others. According to Don Ecker, Vicky Cooper used to work for the infamous Mayflower Madam. and the feds were trying to get the madam and discovered Vicky. Mrs. Cooper was busted and threatened with spending the rest of her life in prison if she did not cooperate. Vicky rolled over. According to Ecker, she ratted on her employer. Since Vicky had apparently had something to do with the bookkeeping operation, she became a key witness. The Mayflower madam was put out of business and into jail thanks to Ms. Cooper's testimony. If Don Ecker was telling the truth. Nonetheless, it's quite remarkable when you think about it, and I have no doubt that the CIA plays hardball to get control over the narrative of X-Tech, advanced aerospace technology, and the UFO file. There's no question in my mind. So you're seeing an awful lot of disinformation on that side. And with that, everyone, we've gone deep on RFK's assassination, and it took place 52 years ago tonight. To think of the type of country that we would have become under a Kennedy presidency. It's a very, very different world.
Can I throw you a curveball?
Sure.
Sometimes I get little psychic impressions, little inspirations while I'm here, and I'm feeling the coherence from the ideas room.
Mm-hmm.
And
great questions from the ideas room tonight.
Yeah, I'm starting to connect dots in a way. I like to keep things as grounded as possible, although that may be hard to believe. I'm starting to open up to the possibility that they want to depopulate because they want alien colonization. And I wanted to ask you what you think of that. Well, it would make sense.
It's a great segue into our next episode, X-91, which is going to be all about the UFO file and the military aerospace contracting agencies around it. So I absolutely think that's a good place to end this. And it's a fascinating question. It is. But, it's worth noting that we live in such a world that we need to explore these questions. Just like the guy was talking about, well, it's outside the box to explore mind control in this case. But when he did, he found all these incredible things. So it is that openness and, not keeping things in a box that will really open us up to what is actually happening. And there's no question, there's a great deal of intrigue around aerospace, the Space Force, the UFO file aspect, and the incredible way that the media is dipping into that now in a very manipulated fashion. This is the crucial piece coming up, because all of these things, the final frontier of this whole control program ends in space. There's no question about it. And I wanted to show this picture. This is Robert Kennedy after the MLK assassination, and he is examining the rioters' damage on the different towns and things. But there he was, putting himself out there as a unity character, trying to unify our purposes under extremely, you can't even imagine what things were like after the MLK assassination. Some of the events of the last week give us some idea, but those, the type of environment for him to be just walking around openly out there shows the kind of bravery. And that's really what Kennedy was looking for, along with his brother, which is that bravery and leading us into a new world. They had that sense that freedom would win the day, and that at the end of the day, the United States was in a position to deliver that to its citizens and for the world. So in that sense, we can look forward to keeping the promise that these incredible people brought forward. And with that, we will see you next Friday.
I have some people to thank.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so super chatters. Michael Collier, Eurythmia's Fun, Jimmy Parker, Splendor Solus, Irie A, Adam Riddle, JJK, Judy Riley, Guy Painter, Tricky Vicky, Biscuit 911, Doyle Wayne, Medley Childress, Crystal Quark, and Alyssa Austin. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Extraordinary, your support for the show. We really appreciate it. It makes all the difference. And to our subscribers, that's really something that helps us tremendously to do the work that we do here. I'll say a few shout outs as we depart. I see Jimmy Parker out there, Shelby Cobra, and of course, Gigi Young. Thank you for being there. Lee Veltman, the man, the myth, Miguel It's great to see you. Firestorm, Stefan. Always great. How are things over there, Stefan? Grandma Tippy Toes, thank you. Tricky Vicky, exceptional as always. Great questions tonight. Scarlet Fire, Crystal Cork, Michael Gopi, KJ, Mr. Wonderful. Hey, wait, that's my name. What's going on there? Andy B, Kate, I know I saw you out there. It's great to have you. Aether, thank you for being here, sir. We will see you all next week. And Olivia, nicely done. A round of applause for Olivia.
Aww.
Incredible work in the ideas room. I applaud you. And to all the incredible work, I highly recommend, of course, that interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on medical tyranny. Very, very timely. And remember, with all the ops that have been going on from COVID and beyond, ultimately, they only fail, they only win, and we only fail when we become out of our center.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can keep that center and get them to answer the tough questions, then we have a pretty even chance of bringing things around. So keep that in mind. It's great to have you here for the X Steganography series number 90. And that is the RFK revelation and breakthrough from tonight. And we'll stay right on top of this as we go. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
You know, it says in broadcast, but you know. Nicely done, Miss Olivia.
Thank you.
Crystal Cork, great to see you out there. Bethany Green, good night. Good night, everyone.